All right, we're live. So let me inform the people on the Discord that we are live. So how have you been today? You've been traveling.
Good. I'm good.
Has it-
Fun,
traveling has been good.
Pretty good, yeah. Not too exotic, but, just like East Coast, like the West Coast, not much. Going to Canada in a month. I guess that's the next time I'm going to leave the country. So,
Uh,
yeah.
so is this for work?
For work, I'm going to Canada for work. Last year I went to Africa, South Africa, and Italy. This year the conferences are in Canada, so it's a little bit of a letdown. Like, it's not as far. So,
Oh, you want? So you prefer when it's farther?
I mean, yeah, for us, we're allowed to go, right? So like the farther away the conference, in some sense, like that's sometimes the main time I travel during the year. Is like
Uh,
is these two conferences that we kind of like all go to. There's the American Society of Human Genetics, that one's okay, and then there's like the International Society.
mm.
So those ones, I mean, the American ones are usually in America, but sometimes they're in like Hawaii or Canada too. And then the international ones, they change a lot. They can be in really cool places.
Mm. So how did you find South Africa when you came to Africa?
It was interesting. I'd never been north of, like, I'd never been south of, I guess, I haven't been that far south Africa at all, actually. So it was weird. Didn't feel like the rest of Africa. I mean, I haven't been everywhere, but it felt different. It felt almost like South America. It didn't feel like Europe or Africa, but it felt kind of reminded me of like Colombia, actually.
Hmm.
But yeah, it was a different sort of place. I learned a lot there, but it was I wouldn't say I was. I mean, most of the people at the conference were from Europe or America or somewhere else in Africa. There weren't that many South Africans at the conference. Mostly West Africans, some people from East Africa, but yeah, not that many South Africans. So I didn't spend a lot of time with South African people in South Africa. But I mean, really
So
big country, man.
were you mostly in Cape Town, or what city were you mostly
Yeah, I
in?
was in Cape Town. The conference was in Cape Town, but then I took tours. Like I stayed a couple days after the conference, kind of drove around. But I mean, it's so big. I did not understand how big it was. I thought the Earth gets smaller as you go farther south. I knew the middle of Africa was big, but I didn't realize even South Africa is so big.
Yeah,
Like driving is so slow. Like it's such a big country, such a big country. So
yeah, there are many big countries in Africa.
yeah, you can't just really go somewhere, right? Like I know, I feel like
Mm.
I guess maybe because I'm from America, but in America you accept that, right? You don't drive from like Los Angeles to like New York. But I feel like most of Europe, you just kind of drive from city to city. You take a train.
Mm.
It's weird to be in a country where like you can't really do that. You have to fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely
Uh,
one of those.
and most of Europe seems to be so very, very integrated that it's easy to just move from country to country.
Yeah,
And I don't know, Europe seems like it's a big place, but it seems like a small place as well.
it's pretty small. Europe's surprisingly small. Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, it feels huge because there's so many different countries and like but it like land wise, it's surprising how much smaller, for example, like France is than South Africa. I thought they were around like the same size. On the map, they look kind of
Mm.
similar, but there's like a huge difference there. I didn't know
So
that.
that's the thing with maps. At times, the maps do not, the way the maps are drawn, do
Yeah,
not give a true reflection of the size of the of the country or of
yeah,
whatever they're trying to depict. So that's the way it is.
yeah. But I didn't know it was that.
Anyhow,
Yeah,
so welcome to Critical African Thinkers study. Welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As we know, this is the place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. The last time I had you here, it was a wonderful conversation, and a lot of people enjoyed the conversation we both had. And the chemistry was good, interaction was on point. You know, so I decided to have you back here so we can talk about some more fun stuff, right? You're a statistician, and of late I've been noticing, that I've been noticing a lot of things with the way statistics is being used. Not really of late. I think I've known this for quite some time now. At times, either the statistics are exaggerated, they're misquoted, or they are, the sort of conclusions that are drawn from them is way off, right? They're used to push certain narratives, and I will call them false narratives. So I just wanted us to look at some of those things today and try to understand how statistics can be used in a misleading manner. Now, the focus of our conversation mostly will be there's a very short clip I sent you about Larry Elder. There were some claims he made, some statistical claims he made when he was talking to I think this guy, uh, this black at the Breakfast Club. There's this black guy that he
Yeah,
talks to at the
Strowman.
Breakfast Club. He
Yeah,
made some claims, right?
I've seen
And
it.
yeah, you saw that, right? And then there is this always this claim of 1350, right? The 13% of the population committing 50% of the crimes as a statistic that is usually thrown out there. So I just wanted to go through these things with you and let us understand. Let us look at these claims made by these statistics. Uh, how accurate are they? How accurate are the conclusions that are drawn from these things? And how reliable are we to be able to make this to at face value to just take people at what they're saying? So let me just get your thoughts first of all. What do you think? How do you think statistics is being used today? What sort of problems have you seen with the way statistics is being used?
Yeah, I mean, I could go into I could talk about this forever, but I mean, um, let's see. I'm trying to give a. I mean, I have a really good example I just thought of, but I think a lot of it is just something. To be fair, I want to be fair here and say sometimes the argument is there's two things and they're both true, and sometimes people just don't agree ahead of time on what they care about. Right. So I saw something online. It's not true. It's false, but it's still interesting, I think. And it was about the divorce rate. So I don't know. Have you heard of the divorce rate in the U.S.?
Yeah, I've
How high
heard
is
of
it?
it. How high? How high? How high? How high? I can't tell how high it is, but I know that what I know about is that 70% of the time women are the ones asking for divorce or initiating divorce. Yeah,
Okay.
that's about the
I'm
much
not
I can
familiar with
remember.
that. The thing everyone says is over half of the marriages end in divorce.
Yeah,
That's
I've
a
heard that too. I've heard
problem.
that too.
And so I saw somebody wrote something, and what they wrote was actually wrong. They messed up on their math, but it was still interesting. Their argument was that actually they call it the true divorce rate. They said it was only like 40%, not 70% or 60%. And they said that's because if you look at there's a bunch of guys that get married four times and they get divorced four times. And
Hmm.
if you look at their math, it doesn't actually hold up because while that's true, that can't that can't actually bring the numbers up that much because those people aren't that common, to be honest. It's not that common to get married four times, even here in the US. But it did bring up a point that they're not the same rates. So if you like take all the marriages, of course, like what is a successful marriage, right? If you define it as like marriage where one person dies, that's how it ends. I mean, it's a little hard statistically to get because you have to sort of that's like that'll always be like lagging like indicator because you're really talking about like the marriage success rate from like 30 years ago if you use that statistic. So that's the first thing. The first point is like if you want to get a handle on whether the marriages are successful today, you can't really use death by like old age as an indicator. Maybe you should use 10 years or like like 20 years. And you should use some other stat. That's the first thing. But then the second thing is, I mean, obviously, when one partner kills the other partner, that's probably not a successful marriage. So we should probably take out those out of. Then there's probably not a high percentage, but that's probably a little bit misleading to call that success. But the main point is that her point, which turned out to be exaggerated, but her point was if you take all the times people get married, and then you take all the times people get married and get divorced, and you divide, that'll give you a divorce rate. But if someone gets married five times and divorced five times, let's make it really extreme. This isn't true, but let's say like there's a few people who get married 100 times and divorced 100 times. But 80% of the people get married once, they stay married. Would it be right to say that the divorce rate is 50%? If no, most people are getting married and not getting divorced, but there's these few people that can get married 100 times. And so she calls it the true rate. It's not true. It's just there's just two different numbers, right? If you're maybe
So it seems like there are a few people who are skewing the data, right? Because the
yeah,
frequency for some
but they're
people
not
is so
skewing the
much that.
data because again, my point is they're not skewing the data. The data is what it is. And if you're like a lawyer,
Mm,
you don't know anything except that two people got married and you want to like maybe you sell divorce certificates. That's your business.
mm,
You're a divorce certificate seller, imagine. And you want to know like how good is like business going to be. And you know that like if there's 10,000 marriages in 10 years, there'll be 5,000 divorces. So like that's the number you care about, 50%. Like that's how many divorce certificates you're going to sell relative to the marriage certificates. So in this case, like the divorce certificate business is half as good because there's half as many. That's all you care about, which is fine. But if you're a person, let's say you're single and you're thinking about getting married, and you're thinking all the other people who were once like me and were about to get married, how many of those ended up getting divorced? And it might be way lower, right? So it's sort of what's the right statistic for you? The idea that one is lying or it's just the data is the data, but like from what perspective do you have, right? So why do you care about this? I think a lot of the crime statistics they come down to this, right? They come down to what's your reason? Like, why do you care about this number? Do you care about this number if you're walking down the street? Are you going to be the victim to a criminal attack? Do you own a prison? Like those two people are going to have very different needs for these numbers. So someone, again, who sells things to help people get divorced, really different from someone who wants to know, am I going to get divorced? Right? Those aren't the same thing at all. In this case, to be honest, with the marriage one, they're not actually that different because people don't really get married 100 times. So they do skew it. It skews it probably by like 10%. But you can imagine with crime and things, the skewing is much worse, right? So it becomes really careful to you don't want to say, oh, this person's a liar, this is a false statistic. It's just that are they applying this statistic for like the wrong question? And that happens all the time. That's constantly being done. So I think that's the biggest one I see that really bothers me. I don't know if we talked about this last time, but I try to bring this up to everybody all the time because it really bothers me, is they do something, and they actually did this to Trump recently, which I found fascinating. So there's a statistic that most, since I think, Jimmy Carter or so, the districts that have majority Republican support have higher income, right? So this is always rich people are Republican. That's what people say, right? Rich people are Republican. They said that, under Bush, Obama, this has always sort of been the thing. Rich people are Republican. Trump came along, and in 2020, that wasn't true. So in 2020, the counties that went for Trump weren't the rich counties. They were more poor on average, right? So this is obviously an aggregate statistic. Think of it what you may. But what I saw that was really interesting was, instead of sort of saying like, oh, that's interesting, why? Right? To me, that's interesting that all the Republicans had been supported by the rich counties less than the poor counties. Now Trump comes along, and that's not true. That is interesting. Right? I don't know what it means, but that is interesting. That's different. But instead, what they did was they said, okay, but if you go into those counties, and then you count people by income, you covary for income, within those counties, Trump is supported by the rich people. So there's nothing to see here. He's still supported by the rich. But there's something to see, because you didn't have to do that extra level of analysis with everyone else, and you do have to do it with Trump. And we should talk about that. That could be interesting. It could be noise. It could be a small difference. But the idea that let's find a way to make that not true, and then let's forget about it. That's done a lot, and there's no lying there. But I mean, there's a little, I would say, I wouldn't call it lying, but there's some dishonesty whenever you see these within group things. Because what does that mean, that the people with more money within counties vote for Trump? So you have a county where people are roughly the same class, right? Because it's, a working class area, or it's a poor area, or it's a rich area, right? So you have some geographic place where there's some commonality among class, and you say, well, okay, those places that have less money are going to vote for Trump. That never happened before, or hasn't happened in a long time, instead of the Democrat. And then you go within county, you say, but within county, it's all the rich people. But within county, think about in your own family, a lot of what being rich is within county is just age, right? So it's 50-year-old people have more money than 20-year-old people. It's usually true. So are they seeing that within counties, wealth predicts a Trump vote, or are they just seeing that within county, older people vote for Trump? If that's all you're showing, then you're not really debunking this stat, right? You're saying, yes, Trump is supported by older people. It seems like people of lower class also voted for Trump. But they don't want to say that. And there's a weird investment with them. They really don't like the idea that Trump is supported by the poor, the working class. They really, at the same time, they say he is, and the working class is fooled. It's people are really invested in not so much just in arguing over politics, but arguing about who the people are that vote for the people. So instead of just talking about Trump, there's a big fight about who are his supporters, right? Which shouldn't matter, if you like him, it's so much better who his supporters are. But that's a huge, people really care about that a lot. So.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. It seems as if people are just they've come to their conclusion and then they try to look for evidence to support that conclusion.
100%. And you can do
And
that. You can do that, and it's not lying, but it's not great. But yeah, you can definitely
yeah,
find a way to make a statistic go away without lying. That's what they do.
mm, yeah.
No. But yeah, so that's
So
the within
I
county
like.
one. The one that I think is really bad, the worst one, is
Mm,
they do the within race one. And I find that just so misleading. I find it so bad because what's interesting is I saw it on the right from this book from like 20 years ago. So these conservatives were making this point that even if you give black people money, they're still going to have higher criminality. And their evidence was this is sort of the same trick that they do, today. They took everybody, I don't know if they were in kids or something, but took everybody and they put them into 5 bins. So like the poorest bin, 0 to 20%, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, that's the middle, and then 60 to 80 and 80 to 100. Right? They put everybody in 5 bins, and of course they always how they handle income, like how they handle parent income, they sort of that's just a great opportunity to cheat. If they want to skew the numbers so class seems to not matter, they'll do things like if you only have one parent, they'll take their income, but if you have 2 parents, they'll take the average of the parents' income, which is really crazy because like having 2 parents that each make $200,000 a year definitely puts you in a higher class than having one parent who makes $200,000 a year, right? So like whether you should take the total or the average, you could say the total is not perfect because parents, there's 2 of them now, so you have to feed 2 parents. You could say like a family has less money with 2 people who earn combined $500,000 than one person. You could make that argument. But I mean, certainly 2 people who earn combined like $500,000, certainly that's more than one person who earns half of that, right? So that's sort of just an opportunity to sort of cheat. But then beyond that, what they do is they give everybody a class ranking, right? So 1 through 5. So 5 is the top, 1's the bottom. Then they look at something like crime rates. So what they do is they'll do this in like Harlem. This was in this old book I read, and they showed that even if black people are in the middle class, their crime rate is still like so much higher. But what's interesting is what is the middle class? The middle class that they created was the black middle class. So that means that they're between the 20th and 40th percentile among black people in that place. So then they say, okay, well, we're comparing in this city, we're comparing middle class black people to middle class white people. But the middle class black people that they're comparing might have twice as much money. So why would we think that that your within race income should drive what you can afford and how many resources? Like it should be the amount of money you have. Now, obviously, it can change. Maybe that doesn't hold up in a different country. Maybe the cost of living is so cheap in a different country that like we should consider you middle class, even if you earn a lot less money. But like within the same country, doing it by race, I mean, it makes sense if you have like racial countries, but you don't. Right? You have black and white people like living in the same society, and you normalize their income by their race as if you're like ranking among your race is more important than how many dollars and cents you have, which is just not the case. But what's crazy is they did this on the right. Now they're doing this on the so-called left, where there's a big paper in there's economics paper, and then there's a New York Times article about this, and it's about black maternal outcomes. And the big, huge claim is even if they're really wealthy, black women are still like X times more likely to die. And that's what they do. So when they compare, when you read it, and they're pretty sneaky, like you have to really read the small print. But when you're reading, black women in the 80th percentile only do as well as white women in the 40th percentile. Then you're like, okay, what's the raw amount of money on average? Like what income is that? Oh, that's the same. Oh, well, I mean, maybe it has to do with what you can afford. It's not as good of a story. But the left sort of wants that story. The right wants a story, and they both end up like using the same lie, which I find in some ways sort of like poetic. I guess there's some sense I see on the right, which I don't really agree with, but I understand their argument that there's some sense of like they cheated first, let's cheat now. I guess in this case the right used this trick first, but there's a lot of times where like they'll use a trick. And then it's like, well, they did it, so like let's just do it too, right? And that's what you kind of see there. You see that the same statistical tricks that are used will be used by people with completely different policies. But I don't think it's one side that likes to lie. I mean, it is just what they do. Yeah.
So,
That's
for
what I mean.
me,
Yeah.
For me, I will be more critical of the rights because I thought they should know better, right? If they're employing the same tactics that the other side is using, I'm like, then all your uh, mantra of objectivity, of facts, of logic, and all, it's all rubbish, right? If
Yeah.
you are employing the same tactics as the other side. But I want to just circle back to the earlier point that was made about the marriage statistics, right? Which is something that they use around the red pill movement circle, right? They'll just bring out these statistics that 70% of marriages are 70% of marriages are of divorces are initiated by women, right? So by extension, they're not going to look at the other extenuating circumstances. What's causing this divorce, right? Who is to blame mostly for what's happening in the marriages that's leading to divorce? They're going to ignore all that because they want to paint the narrative that women are destroying marriages. But
Mhm.
if you just drill a little bit deeper to find out why these marriages are breaking up in the first place, you might just find out that probably the men are even worse off in the marriage, right? They might be contributing as much as the women to why the marriage is breaking up, right? So in that way, it just shows how statistics, which can be literally true if you look at it from the plain sense. Yes, 70% of women are asking for divorce, but you need to drill a little bit deeper to find out what is really going on for you to have the whole picture. But it's just used to paint a false narrative to just give the dog a bad name, as they would say.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's I don't really put a lot of weight in that statistic. I mean the divorce rate. I think it's fair to say that it's alarming that like there's this institution that fails so often. It is right, but I think that I don't know. Like I understand that. Like I guess I watched the Larry Elder clip. He thinks the biggest problem is fatherlessness or something, right?
Yeah, I'm going to play that clip now. So
Yeah.
I think, and I had to do some research to just check out some of the claims he made, and many of them were sort of wrong anyway. So let me find the clip and just play shortly. Yeah.
We didn't really get into mass incarceration, but most people who are behind bars because they committed a violent crime against somebody else. And often the black people who are behind bars committed a violent crime against another black person. The number one social problem in America, by far, is the epidemic not of COVID, but of fatherlessness. 70% of black kids today enter the world without a father in the home, married to the mother. In America, 60% of the shootings, the robberies, and the homicides are committed by black people.
So from that clip, from the little research I was able to do, everything he said there was wrong. I mean, all the statistics he quoted was wrong. So, for example, he stated that um, violent crimes, that most of the people in prisons are there for violent crimes. Totally not true. We're going to look at that later. He
Really?
said that, okay, yeah, it's not most of the people in prison are not there for violent crimes. In fact, let me even share my screen and let me share my screen and present this. You will see. Share screen. Okay.
I've looked at this before. I looked. It does depend if you do like federal prison versus jail. I thought
Yeah.
murder
So
related was almost half. That's what I remember.
can you see my screen?
Mhm.
All right. So this is from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, right? And you can see the various offenses listed here. You can see there is banking, insurance, counterfeit 0.1%, burglary 4.9, continual criminal enterprise 0.2, courts or corrections 0.4. The biggest here, drug offenses 44.5% was from drug
Yes,
offenses.
but this is misleading as well.
Extortion, yeah. This is misleading.
I think this is a little bit misleading. Yes.
Okay, so what issues do you have with this?
To go
Let me
up,
hear your thoughts.
well, I just want to know how they got this number because I've seen like where's this number from? This is from like FBI statistics or where?
Yeah, this is from the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Okay, so this is statistics based on prior months data. Okay.
This is last updated 19th August 2023.
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but from what when I looked at, try to get into the prison data, it's hard because like the numbers seem to be wildly different. But the drug offense thing, also, the way you classify this can be like really complicated. So, for example, the drug offense, if somebody like kills somebody and they were also selling drugs and they get a count for drug offense and for murder, do you count them as both, or do you count them as one? Like, does that number sum to 100% there? It looks like it does, right? So, like, that's an issue. Is like, how do you count them? But then the big difference is again, are we considering people who go to prison, which I think is fair to say, like, do you want to talk about, so we could talk about the last 10 years and say, let's talk about everyone who's been to prison. And then let's see why they've went. And then let's divide that by everybody who's went to prison. And then murder is going to be a pretty small percentage if you do that, right? Because of the crimes that land you in prison, murder is not that common. But if you do like the amount of days spent in prison, right? Then the people. So what he's saying is he's being a little tricky. He's saying the majority of people in prison. That's if you look about long time span. The people that are in prison for a really long time, they're there for murder. That's the longest sentence. So if you're talking about like
he wasn't talking about sentences. He was talking about, he said the vast majority of people in prison are there for violent crimes.
Prison or who go to prison. Right? So those are very different. And like, to me, like,
we didn't really get into mass incarceration, but most people who are behind bars are behind bars because they committed a violent crime against somebody else. And often the black people who are behind
most people are behind bars.
I think
behind bars because they committed.
Yeah, I think he gives himself some leeway there, right? Which is what they do, right? And it's this, because usually if you do a drug crime, you get arrested and you go to jail, and oftentimes you don't even go to prison. But you could be in jail for a year, right? So then you don't even count as a prisoner. But you were there, like, you got arrested, you were behind bars. I guess he's being a little behind bars is definitely, I would say, misleading, because I mean, if you want to say prison and you want to like qualify what that means surely not a jail. He didn't do that. So that's wrong, I guess. But I would say that there's a very big difference in the numbers if you look at days in prison divided by the crime versus have been to prison or, were sentenced divided by the crime. Like, murder is the only thing that you go to prison for a really long time. But I will say, I've looked into this a lot, and it's more complicated than this. Like, I would say, to be fair, you don't really know the truth here. And that's because there's two reasons. One is, so like the mass incarceration, like, it's something you're not going to get, like, it's hard to know the truth about this because there's just not a real honest analysis done by people. There's people who are like, think we need more people in prison and people who think we need less in prison. You don't really get people who are sort of sober-minded and like they wanted to know about this. I tried to do this. The first thing you see is, well, I mean, like, mass incarceration says that there's too many people in prison. That's the idea. Too many people in prison. It means that, like, we free a lot of people. But if you ask people, they'll say things like, I think there's too many people in prison. And you say, well, should we let out people who killed somebody or that? Like, no way, those people should be in prison. And to some extent, that's a little bit incompatible. If you're really against prison population being big, and you really think everyone who kills somebody should be in prison for the rest of their lives, the prison population can't be that small. Right? But then it gets worse because we have a lot of people that have killed someone who haven't been caught. Right? Can you hear? There's a lot of static. I'm hearing some type of feedback.
Yeah, you hear some feedback.
Yeah, like really loud.
I think it's coming from. Is it better?
A little bit better, yeah. It's still Oh,
maybe I have to take this off and just
that's you there? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It's gone. The feedback's gone. Okay, yeah. So I don't know where I was now, but oh yeah. So from this perspective, you say, well, this whole mass incarceration doesn't make sense because you don't believe that we should let out people, and that's that's a lot of people in prison are there because they killed somebody. And then also, we only solve like half the murders. So would you think society is better if we solved all the murders? So if you solved all the murders, you would double people in prison for murder. Well, that would certainly mean that like even if you free a few people now for like nonviolent, offenses, if you captured everyone who killed somebody, the population would still go up. So you actually favor increasing the prison population, right? So that's a fair argument, right? That like there are people who now we don't know the people who don't get caught. They already are in prison for a different murder, right? This is just, it's not something we know, right? So like we know that the murder rate, that the amount of people in prison for murder probably isn't the total amount of people that killed somebody, right? There are people who kill people who get away with it, right? So presumably if you caught them, you want to put them in prison, you might increase the population. So that's one point. But then the other point is that I think people don't know unless you sort of looked into the criminal like justice system here. It's not, people are very aware of like the Innocence Project and like, a racist cop and somebody didn't kill somebody, but they went to prison and then they're freed. But I mean, honestly, it's not that of all these people in prison for murder, it's not that so many of them were like wrongfully accused, but it is true that a lot of them didn't kill anybody. That's actually true. And so if you look at the way the laws work, like in many states, like, you'll do something like you and your friend will go rob somebody. And then your friend will get shot by the homeowner. They'll kill your friend. And now you'll get charged with murder. So like the definition of murder legally is often if someone gets killed in the commission of a crime. If you're doing a crime, someone dies, you can get murder. So I think that, yeah, sure, I guess it's murder, right? So if you think everyone who murders should be in prison and you want to call that murder, but I think people aren't aware of that when they're thinking about all these people in prison for murder. A lot of them, and it's not that they did nothing wrong, but a lot of them were there as part of a group of people, right? And somebody did kill somebody or someone did die, but they didn't shoot them. They didn't pull a trigger. And I think it's a real issue I have with just, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm red pilled or black pilled or anything, but I think this is just, I have a difference in, this is not a math thing. I just philosophically don't understand the weird punishment based on like the consequences where like the outcome is looked at for the punishment. So like if you're going to rob somebody and then the homeowner shoots your friend, it's like, you should be in prison for a really long time because like somebody died because of what you did. Whereas if you actually went to somebody and shot them in the chest a bunch of times and they didn't die, you'd have a shorter sentence. That's never made sense to me. Because to me, it's just like when you're thinking about punishment and like motivation, intent is just more important. And I just like, you shot somebody and you killed them because you have bad aim. So I still don't really want to be around you, right? Like I still think that like that's going to be, you have to really convince me that you should like that you're a safe person if you're the kind of guy that does that. Whereas if you rob somebody, that's bad, and then someone died, that's really tragic. But I think that I would not feel the same apprehension to having you like be free, or I wouldn't feel like you're as much of a risk to society just because someone died in your crime, whereas somebody didn't die in the other crime. But that's how the criminal justice system works. It's really based on if somebody died, right? To a fault, even, I would say, because it isn't the most important thing. So like I would say like we just don't know, because I tried to get that data. I've tried to like look up that data, and it's just really not well aggregated. Like you can get the data and you'll see a murder charge, and you can go and pull up that record. You can read every individual record, and then you can try to like read the court case and see like the charge is murder. Did they actually kill anybody? Like what happened? Like right? Like there was a. It's like there isn't really an honest. There isn't like a. I wish there was a statistic that like this person killed somebody. We had all the number of people that killed somebody, like how many people, whether they're not like whether they're in prison, but we don't have that. These statistics, they're not well kept, and I don't think we really know. That's sort of what I would say. But I mean, I think that Larry Elder's not completely off to, maybe you don't fall for this, but there is a perception that I know people have that they think American prisons are just full of nonviolent drug offenders. And they think that like that's 99% of the population. So that they think that, oh, you could just free those people and you wouldn't have any problem with like mass incarceration. That's not true. So America is not extremely violent, but it's not Japan here. Like people do get killed, and those people do go to prison, and we're not going to have you're not going to have a tiny prison population, and not allow people to kill people. You can't have both of those to some extent. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So I get that point, and I agree with that point. You know, the other side would always exaggerate that, oh, almost everybody in prison is there for non-violent reasons.
Mhm.
You know, they're just people who are smoking weed and then were arrested for that. Of course, that's rubbish, right? So
Yeah.
now back to the point that Larry Elder made, right? Which is in terms of homicide is correct, right? The homicide rates for blacks is around 50 something percent, right? But in terms of when you want to aggregate violent crime together, it comes to around 26%, right?
Mhm.
So those are two separate things. However, the point I'm trying to drive with this conversation with what I call the 1350 lie is this, right? Is 13% of the population actually responsible for 50% of the crime? Because you
Yeah.
have to drill it down to who are the number of people, who are the people doing this crime.
Yeah.
From the statistics I saw about for blacks, it's about 1.1 million black people who are responsible for these violent crimes across all the ranges. Now in America, there are about 44 million black people, right?
Mhm.
If you take the percentage of 1.1 to 44 million people, you're going to get something that's not even close to 50%, right?
Mhm.
So when you say 13%, I mean, when you say 13% is committing 50% of the crime, what you're doing by essence is just ascribing guilt by association, which is something the right doesn't like. If you
Mhm.
tell white people that, oh, that they're racist or that they are slaveholders or they are evil for what their ancestors did, they don't like to hear that, right? Because
Mhm.
they are not personally responsible for whatever
Yeah.
the ancestors did, whatever a racist person did, right? But when you say that 13% of the population commits 50% of the violent crimes of murders, it's essentially the same thing. You're essentially ascribing guilt to what? To the people. You're essentially ascribing guilt to a whole group of people, 13% of the population, and painting black people as criminals when the number is far lower than that. So that's really what gets me
But why
mad
stop at
about this.
13% though? Why not go like 6.5%? Because I don't think the like women are responsible for that many crimes, not the violent crimes, right? So why would they say like 13%? Why not say like 6%? That's even more striking, right? Say 6% of people are
Yeah.
responsible, right? And then why not go further, right? Like so, most of these crimes are not done by black men under the age of 10, or even black men under the age of 15, and almost surely not like above the age of 50. You probably have a window, age 15 to like 35. So what is that? That's maybe 30% of the men. So that gets you to like 2%, right? So you have 6% to get, for men, and then it's around a third of them, or even in the age range where it's even possible to like commit crime. So you can just say 2% of the country is responsible for 50% of the murders or whatever this. I mean, you can just go smaller and smaller, right? Like you can really drill down if you really want. But yeah, I don't think it makes the question is like if you drill down into the if you drill down enough, you're gonna get that like 0.1% is responsible for 50% of the crime, because in that cohort of 0.1, they're all criminals, right? So like eventually you're going to get to some number that's true, and that's going to be like the actual population of criminals. Like that's obviously the percent. 100% of them are criminals, but it's just where you stop before that. That's based on your politics. Like you're like that's based on you, right? Like why do they stop at black but not male? Right, and the male one makes probably more sense, because I would say that like that one, it doesn't really make sense why you get to 13 but not 6, because the first thing you like the biggest real variable here is sex. Like men commit way more crimes than women, right? But we don't find it shocking that like less than half the population commits like 95% of the murders. That's true, right? But again, I think it's because we're sensible enough to know that like less than, I mean, it's not true. I guess some people aren't, but there are people who, there's like different anti-male like movements. I guess it happens, but I think most of us know that saying like, can you believe that this population of only 48% of us, all the men, are responsible for like such a high percentage of murders. And again, they could even get worse, right? They could say, okay, only men aged 10 to 40 or whatever, and they could get it down without race. You could probably get it to like where you could make an argument that 25% of the country is responsible for 95% of the murder, and that 25 is going to be men of a certain age, right? But the reason why like this isn't a useful exercise is because the denominator of that 25%, the vast majority of them are doing murders. And so it's just sort of it's a silly exercise in a way, but it is like where you decide to play that game, that probably says something about you, but it's a game that you can play in sort of any direction you want, right? And I think it's more interesting to talk about the people that you're leaving out, right? Because that's the real question. Is each time you like when you go from like race, like gender and age, what you're doing to get those like numbers to work like that is you're taking out a block of people that have a demographic characteristic who don't commit crime, right? So you're taking out women. Like, yes, you lose a few murders because there are females that murder, but like if I ignore all the women, I can get rid of half the population in only a small percentage of murders. So now I have a more concentrated group. If I get rid of all the really old people, they don't do as much. If I get rid of the kids, right? So, but you're not getting a group, but what you don't, I mean, unless you go all the way, you end up with a group that is de-riched for non-murderers, but not necessarily enriched for murderers, right? So like if you pick someone from this group, aged 10 to 50, Black in the US, the chance that that person is a murderer is still very small, right? But I've taken out groups where like they hardly ever do murders, like women, or old people, kids. I took those out to try to make it seem worse for that person. But the question is, did you get down to a group where the probability is high in that group? If you didn't do that, then really the analysis should be about the other groups. The question should be, why don't women kill, right? Because that's the truth. Like that's why you're able to do that, because you have groups that don't do the activity, right? Because that's how you can sort of inflate this and still have a final set where the activity is rare. It's because you got rid of people where the activity is extremely rare. Right? So yeah, I mean, I think again, it's not necessarily dishonest, but yeah, like there's a lot of motivation behind that number, right? But I mean, it's the same as a woman who says like, I'm afraid of men because men are responsible for 98% of the rapes or something like that. I'm sure there's some stat like this, right? But the question that I think, again, what's the statistic for, right? Is the statistic for, I don't know, designing like different clothes that I can't even, like that you're going to sell to someone in prison. So you want to know like their like demographics when they're there? Or is the statistic, I think for crime, the statistic should usually be for you as a citizen, right? I think that's the point. I think the point is for you to think, what's my risk of this person killing me? Like, how fearful should I be? And I don't think it makes sense to, even though 45% of the population does 99% of the rapes, I don't think it makes sense to be afraid of that 45% of the population, right? Because I think that the baseline risk that you see a male and that male tries to rape a stranger is pretty low, and that's sort of what matters, right? So that you sort of inflated the number by ignoring a group that almost never rapes women, which is females, but you didn't actually really inform yourself, right? Because that's really what you're asking, in my opinion, right? Like, why else do you care? So, but yeah, that stat is, and then Elder blames it all on fatherlessness, which is again one of those things that I take issue with, but I think it's not totally wrong, but it's one of my least favorite explanations for like sociological phenomena.
But even his fatherlessness argument is still, the statistic is still off, because from what I saw, the amount of Black children living with their, it's still terribly bad, right? But it's 43%. 43% of Black kids live with the father and the mother, whether or not they're married, but the father and the mother are in the home, right? Which still leaves about 57%. That's still a very bad number. However, to just exaggerate to say 70% of Black kids are living without a father, right? There might be some couples that are not married, but they're together, right? That's a family with a father and a mother. Did they take all those things into consideration?
Well, I think the reason why they don't do that is because this started out as a moral claim, Like if you look at the history of this argument, the thing is it's a great argument statistically because it steals a lot of power from money, right? It's pretty clear that like if you have two parents, you probably have more money. One is less than two, right? So like, is it the father? Is it the fact that you don't have a dad, or is it the fact that your parents live in sin and they didn't get married, or is it the fact that you just have less money? I'm not saying that there's no effect of not having a father. I'm just saying that you're never controlling for this huge variable that's just less money, right? Like having one parent, you usually have less than if you have two, right? So that's why like this is it has so much explanatory power, but how much of that is actually independent of the financial difference? That's debatable, but clearly a lot of it's not. That's the first problem. But then the second problem is this was started as a moral issue. Like if you look at history, they didn't used to say that it was a problem. So if you look at like really old stuff from like the 80s and 90s, they never said like like the concept of black fatherlessness wasn't a thing. It was out of wedlock births, right? So they would say like the problem with black people is out of wedlock births, and that's super Christian, obviously, right? Because that now they're saying like doesn't matter. Even if you like get married, if you have that baby and you're not married yet, you're gonna have bad stuff's gonna happen to you because that's sinful. That's bad. And so like to count that as a like to say, oh, we expect worse outcomes for someone who was born and his parents they got married a few months later, they've been together the whole time. That doesn't make that much sense unless you have a really religious perspective. You think that like, you know, there's a religious reason that like you'll be punished or something for that mistake. Of course, when you talk about out of wedlock births and you like aggregate it across, you know, many people, you start to find, okay, well, a lot of the people who have birth out of wedlock, they have, you know, they don't have two parents, so they make less money, so they have less money. So again, out of wedlock birth is explanatory, but again, it's always going to be explanatory because it's going to steal some of that power from the like financial part. Now they switched it to like father or to this. I think to make this argument that it was the Great Society that made these perverse incentives instead. And I guess maybe they did this because the religious argument is not as popular. People would just start to call BS on that. But I mean, we have data in the world, right? So we have, I think, is it Finland? I forget the country, but I think Finland has incredibly low marriage rate now. Like it just dropped massively. But it turns out like for whatever reason in that country, people get together, then they have kids, and then they stay together, and then sometimes they get married later on. Like marriage, just for whatever reason, they start getting married later and later, or sometimes not even at all. But it has like no effect on the kids, right? So like you mostly have two parents. So like this obsession with marriage and outcomes, we don't really. I mean, I'd love to see their argument. Maybe there's some, right? Maybe there's like some evidence that like everything else equal, if your parents didn't get that marriage certificate, they're so sinful that like something's a little worse. Maybe it's true, right? But like that hasn't been asked. They're not asking that question, right? Because they're never looking at like is everything else equal, right? But they're sort of applying this thing, and it's also the worst thing about it. The thing that's so frustrating about this claim is nobody really believes it, because if you believed it, then wouldn't you solve the problem by like you could just pay people to get married? They would get married, right? But no one actually thinks that would work. Right, so it's clearly like this fatherlessness. Like to say it's an epidemic. It makes it sound like there's just like this cultural idea that like is sweeping the country of like, yo, have a kid. No, dad, I'm gonna do that. Everyone's doing that. If you like passed a law and said, hey, you can't do that, or like if when you give birth you're like married to the father on paper, you get $10,000. Like something. If you did that, it would like cure the like the problem, but nobody thinks that. Like so, like I just think it's really misleading to call it an epidemic because it's curable, but we know the cure wouldn't work, right? Because I think the cure is really like the fatherlessness is probably somewhat a cause, but more of a symptom, right? It's more of a symptom of a problem, and they just kind of harp on this because it sounds good. Yeah, and the constituents really like this one. So yeah, but I've never loved that argument that if you just cured if you just like cured it, everything would be better. Because I just don't think that's true.
So for me, I think it's a good thing to have both parents in the house. I think a father in the house does a lot of good. A mother in the house does a lot of good. And I've even seen cases where the mother dies and everything just goes to shit, right? So it isn't really about the father being in the house. It's about the balance that he brings, right? It's about mostly finance. People are overlooking the role that finance
Yeah,
plays
I
in
agree.
outcomes.
Yeah, that's got
Like
to be.
like the example you gave of Finland just now, right?
Yeah,
People overlook if you have a father in the house that is irresponsible, that is poor, that is,
yeah,
there's so many other things. Merely having a father in the house doesn't magically change or solve
yeah,
all those issues. It
exactly.
doesn't, right?
Yeah,
So this fixation, it's a good thing have fathers in the house, but
yeah,
I think that even when you have that 100%, some of these problems will persist because this is like a single cause narrative. There are so many factors that are interacting to produce whatever you're saying right now,
exactly.
right?
Yeah,
So people are just fixating on, oh, there are no fathers in the house. That's why the crime rate is going this. What if you have a father in the house and there is no mother, right? And the father goes off to work and he can't, he doesn't know where his kids are for most of the time. You're still going to have the same results, right?
yeah,
So it's more about socioeconomics than about the presence of or the absence of the father. It's mostly socioeconomics, and for the fact that most society the extended family unit now is has been disintegrated. At least in Africa, we used to have that is which is still falling apart right now. You used to have that extended family structure, right? So even
yeah,
if your father isn't around, there are other male figures around your grandfather, your
yeah.
uncles, older cousins that are around. They're able to shape this person, right? And then you have a better structure around you as a family unit to really, really, really guide you. So there are a lot of problems going on in America that is causing all these problems.
Interesting though, what
It's
you said is there was a paper about that recently that they looked at black kids in Silver Spring in Maryland, and they found that like in Silver Spring, Maryland, not having a dad is not as predictive for bad outcomes. And the claim, which again, there's probably some truth to it, is exactly what you said. They said because in Silver Spring, if you don't have a father, there's more male teachers in the school. The other kids usually have a father. There's more male coaches, so there's just more male role models, and there's just more black men to look up to for the kids. So even without a father, it's not as bad as long as you have lots of male like role models. Then not having a dad in your specific, and it's probably true to some extent, but also people in Silver Spring, man, they just have more money, man. So it's also like, and they like, and then if you don't correct for that, it's like, well, yeah, it's also true that like not having a father when you're wealthy, it's not as bad, right? So there's I'm not saying there's no the social argument of development and like role models. I'm not saying it's not real at all, but I think that when you do that and you ignore income, it's just like you have to start there. Right? It's also like that's also where you should start, not just because it explains so much of the problem and so much of the variance. It's also like if you care about politics and policy, like that's something you might be able to change. You might be able to right? Like people's income can be influenced by policy, or like whether or not someone decides to get married in a free country. It's kind of a weird thing to try to fix, right? So it's like income makes sense to look at. A explains a lot. B, it's like that's a variable that can change based on like the rules of the country, but they just ignore it, right? And I guess it's not like income is money in the U.S. has become a really like we're weirdly averse to admitting how much it matters. Like I see people write papers, statistics, just finding a way to argue around and ignore the income variable, finding a way to like hide it in the variable that they like. And even like my belief, I'll admit I have a huge bias here, is that I think that income, where it fails, is because income isn't even a perfect measure of class, right? So like what they'll do is they'll do something like I explained. They'll do like within race income, which is nonsense, and then they'll make an argument. See, it's not class that matters, it's race. It's like racism. That's why they're doing bad, even though they have as much money. Well, they don't really have as much money because you did within race income, so that's false. But they'll make this argument, right? Or let's say that they do an honest analysis of income, which they don't, but imagine that they did, and it still wouldn't describe all the variance, right? Because no variable describes everything. Then you have this like leftover variance, right? So it's like 20% of the change isn't described at all by money. So that must be racism. It could be, right? But it's also that income itself probably doesn't perfectly describe your finances. Like I know some people who 1 year their dad made a lot of money in like pharmaceutical sales, but then he went to prison. So like that year they'd be counted as like rich because they had a bunch of money 1 year. Like no, it's probably the concept of class is hard to boil down to one variable, but there's probably some better idea of like financial stability, right? Just like where your family is, like in case you have a problem, can they help you out? Do they have savings, right? Like, does your extended family have money? I think that this variable, which we don't even, which like income is only a rough approximation for that. But I think that's probably the variable that would explain the most. But we don't even really have that variable. And rather than saying, oh, I wonder why income isn't doing a perfect job, like, predicting these outcomes, maybe we should try to make this sort of class variable like a little bit like better, right? Maybe we should use your like multi-year income to like smooth out those bumps. Maybe we should look at your extended family, all these, but instead of doing that, we just, okay, well, it's definitely not financial. But I think that's nonsense. I think it's financial. And when the income model fails, it might be that it's failing to accurately model the financial variable, right? It's not necessarily like, it's not perfect evidence that it's not financial. It could be that you're not modeling that in the right way, which I think is probably the case.
Yeah. So in terms of this income, I don't know if you know these guys, that the Andrew Tates and his brother Tristan, right? So there was one clip where Tristan said that he has been able to turn so many girls from different backgrounds to the webcam business. So, but the only girls that he could not turn were girls whose fathers were rich, were girls from wealthy families.
Yeah.
So you can't tell me that even if you have a father in the house, you have a mother in the house, and then there are pressing financial issues, it's not an excuse, right? Poverty is never an excuse for doing the wrong thing. But you can't tell me that the likelihood that someone is going to um, do crime, someone is going to do something shady, is not higher for someone who is going through some financial
Of course.
difficulties than someone who isn't going through any financial difficulties. So
Yeah.
even if you have everything similar, both families have fathers and mothers in the home, just changing socioeconomics alone can lead
Yeah.
to widely different outcomes for both people,
I
which is
mean,
something that
this is a really
people are
good
not
example.
looking at.
Yeah, no, this is, and so instead of, so like Larry Elder says, fatherlessness is an epidemic. The problem is these kids don't have fathers. So what if you just tweak that a little bit? What if we say like, you know what would really help these kids? If they had a really rich dad. Everyone's like, of course. Like, yeah, if you give them a father with a ton of money. So if they already have a father, replace them with one with a bunch of money, just like, imaginary somehow. So we give them all very, very rich dads. Everyone's like, well, of course that's going to help. That doesn't sound profound at all, like very interesting. But the truth is, when you compare people with no dads to people with dads, well, if you have no dad, you definitely don't have a rich dad, right? So like you're stealing from this like not that interesting variable, right? Like all the kids with no dads don't have a rich dad. That's true, right? So of the group that has a dad, some of them have rich dads, and things are easier for them. So naturally, like it's going to look like whether or not you have a father is really important. And I'm not saying it's not important at all, but I'm just saying that whether or not you have a rich father, that gets lumped into that, right? So you're taking some of the explanatory power from that variable, and that variable is one that nobody would find like interesting or like shocking. Like he wouldn't say that. He wouldn't say like, I've done some research and kids with rich dads end up with like better outcomes. We'll say, of course, like this is not at all interesting, right? So you're sort of taking from a fact that is pretty like accepted, like mundane, and you're applying it to this other sort of like claim that to me is it's a moral claim. And I think it's actually good. The data that you saw is actually, I think that's encouraging, right? Because it shows that people instead of looking at like the marriage certificates or whatever, they actually went and did some research, and they looked at who has fathers in the homes. And they said this matters more, right? So that's in a way a good thing. It shows that somebody like, because I think originally these claims were just based on whether their parents are married, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's good.
I wanted to
It's good to get
I
a
wanted to
better
respond to
Yeah.
I wanted to respond to some of the things that is going on in the chat. No, essay, you're making some points, right? So, okay, for example, you said baby mama culture contributes to this. Obviously, of course, right? I'm not arguing against those things. I'm not saying the culture is perfect. I'm not saying the culture is not to blame, right? I'm saying I'm talking about the use of statistics to push certain narratives. This, simultaneous things can be true at the same time, right? It can be true that there is a problem with black culture, but it can also be true that, socioeconomics can be a part of why that problem is or why that problem persists, right? So just looking at it from, from very narrow lens, this is not an either or situation. I'm not saying, oh, because I'm saying socioeconomics, you should look at socioeconomics. I'm automatically saying, oh, black culture is perfect. They don't have to take any
Yeah.
responsibility. That's not what I'm saying at all. Those are two different things, right? I'm not saying go and give black people money, right? Those are two different things. I'm saying that more money would help. I'm not saying
Yeah.
give them money, right? So when this argument comes about, oh no, baby mama culture, those in those communities themselves, the men who are impregnating these women, they are no good as in the first place. So
Yeah.
how much do you think they would contribute to the lives of those women if they were even married to them? Because
Yeah. No,
you
I
see
mean,
one man having kids with multiple women, right? So it's not just the women having kids with multiple men. It's the men themselves having kids with multiple women. So the men there are problems with those men to begin with,
I mean,
and having those men
the claim though,
can
you
even be
know
more.
where this big claim where it comes from, right? Like the conservatives, you know why they say that is the problem. You know about the claim about like Lyndon Johnson and all this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
The
this is sort
welfare
of
thing and all that.
their claim is that like the welfare created this culture. It created this like perverse incentive where women were like motivated not to be married or not to even have the father of the child in their life because they could get so much money from the government. That's the claim, right? So I mean, I do think it's interesting because I think that like this is where I think the left kind of loses out because the modern left doesn't really care about the truth like it used to. And if you think about on the left, like the like modern left, like the like Democrats today, if you like talk to them, you say like, okay, I notice if I look at like some of like the outcome data, I look at like the 1970s and 80s, I see that a lot of outcome data, like crime kind of went up, and outcomes were like really bad for like black people, right? And it's like, and now the crime rates is a lot higher and all this, and I guess if you talk to someone like on the I guess today's far right, they say, oh, it's like DNA. They have like low IQs, so they can't. They're just stupid, so they can make crimes, right? And then on like the far left, they have like almost equally like magical idea about like racism, right? It's like there's this force of racism that wasn't there in the '60s and it picked up in the '70s, and so much personal racism that was like that people are experiencing, and that's why they commit crimes as a response. It's all racism. Like this is evidence of racism, and then so I think those are sort of the extreme arguments. But what's crazy is while the DNA argument isn't really mainstream, right? Yes, people say it. Yes, there are racists, but I don't think like the modern Republican Party says that. Whereas the modern Democratic Party does bring up racism, but the far you have to be pretty far, I guess, outside of the sort of political spectrum to be allowed to say that about that race itself is the cause. But then in the more acceptable, the argument that conservatives make is basically Lyndon Johnson ruined everything because he created all these perverse incentives, and then you had these poor women, and then they just wanted to have kids because they were basically each kid they had, they got more money, so they had to like do this to survive, and it was all maybe some of them are more conspiratorial. It was a scam to actually ruin the black family, or maybe it was by accident, but either way, like that's what happened. And there are some. I mean, I don't think it's a useless claim. I don't think it's meaningless. I don't think it's not true on like there's some evidence. I forget the name, but there were some people who were like huge activists and they were like socialists kind of, and their idea was to get as many people on welfare to like bankrupt the government to turn it social. So like I don't think there's like nothing to it, but what it ignores is like in the 70s and I mean starting I guess in the 50s, it was like there was deindustrialization, there was like automation. What happened was like everyone just started to lose their job. It's like all the good jobs went away, right? So like all the good working class jobs left. And that's probably where you should start. But that's an argument like you don't really hear about, right? You don't hear that one. You hear it's racism or it's race. Those are two people like having that argument. And then there's the only the one that's, and then there's the conservative argument. It's bad incentives. It's too much welfare, right? But like, what about the argument that there weren't jobs, right? Like, because what's interesting is if you look at the outcomes, if you look at like 1950, and you look at, there was definitely something to the fact, I think it's exaggerated on the left, but there's definitely some truth to like access to GI Bill and access to some of the post-war benefits weren't as available to Black people as they were to whites, but still a lot of Black people got them and used them, right? And what happened is basically by the time civil rights happened, the Black people and white people were for a few more years able to sort of get these jobs and move to the suburbs, like leave like the tenements. But there were more Black people in the tenements as these jobs went away. There was more Black people. But what's interesting is the white people who hadn't yet left and like who hadn't made it to like the suburbs, 20 years later, they're in the same boat, right? So the idea that there's this unique thing to call, it's just basically the people who hadn't made it yet kind of got screwed in like 1970 because it started to be really, really hard to make it, right? It started to get harder and harder to make it. So everyone like whose family hadn't figured it out yet or hadn't, got lucky, there was no way to do it now. So they were stuck. But the Blacks and the whites, like who were there, are in the same boat. There's actually more whites in that boat, but yes, there's a higher percentage of Blacks relative to the population, right? But it's the idea that it would be race. You would see all the white people making it out. If it was racism, you would see, right, like in either way, right? If the IQ people were right or the other people were right, you'd see this really big difference. But if you look at the class variable, you see that like, yeah, the people that got stuck when the sort of the economic landscape of the country got a lot worse, those people got stuck. And yeah, I mean, and it's not to say that Great Society was perfect or that, things couldn't be better had they thought better about how to like implement like these programs. That's always true, but it's unfortunate that it ignores, and it is a weird thing when people talk about like the left. This is, I would say, sort of the traditional left argument. It was like, wait a second, there's no more jobs, everything is offshored now. There's no more like, I used to go down to the docks and become like a longshoreman. You could like support your whole family with like a blue collar job. You can't do that anymore. That's a huge problem. But like, that's like, where did like those people are gone? Like that voice is just not interesting to people. To me, it's like the most plausible argument, and it's the least interesting one. I just don't think it gets any play, which I don't really understand why.
Yeah. So let me let me respond to you. Let's say you're Nigerian, just like me, right?
Where's the chat? Why
Probably,
can't I see the chat?
You definitely know Lagos. I don't know. You definitely know Lagos, right? Lekki, highbrow area. Mushin, lowbrow area, right? These are the same people. These are the same races, right? One is poverty-ridden. One is populated by rich people, well-to-do people. Would you be able to compare the level of crime in both communities? These are literally the same people. Would you be able to come? So what explains the difference between the level of crime, which is very high in the place like the Mushin, and the low level of crime in the places like VI, Ikoyi, and Lekki? What explains that? Socioeconomics. People in those other areas are very poor, and poor people do terrible things. Poor people steal, poor people rob, poor people do all sort of things, cultism, criminalism, everything. All of those things are explained by socioeconomics, right? So Esther, you were saying something about Larry Elder trying to draw a rational position from the statistics. And I'm asking you, when has Larry Elder ever brought up the socioeconomic angle? When has he ever said, you know what, maybe part of the problem is that Black people are just poor in these areas, right? Maybe, if their economic situation improves, maybe some of this problem would be solved. But they keep very, very laser focused on, fatherlessness. And it's missing, It's missing the big picture. It's missing a whole lot of context. It's missing a whole lot of things. That's the point I'm trying to make. Yeah, you can make the observations and say fatherlessness is a problem. But if you solve that problem, which I think should be solved, it's not going to take away the problem. It's not going to be the solution to the problems in the black community, because there's something very big that people are ignoring: socioeconomics.
But I would say I don't know if you would say it should be solved by him. Like, he's running for president, right? So I would say, if you want to talk about that, I think that's a great thing for the pastor to talk about, right? So you go to like the neighborhood church, and the pastor is really obsessed with people not being married. He's trying to get people to like be married and not have too many kids, right? So he's like really trying to do his best to help his people where he lives in his church. Like, he wants people in his church to make like better decisions. That's fine. I told him, but like, I don't. Is that the president's job? Is the president's job to fix fatherlessness? It doesn't really seem like what you'd expect in a country there where like religion and the state are supposed to be separate, right? Like, Larry Elder, to me, it's not just that. It's fine if he wants to make that. I think, there's different arguments for like different spaces. Like, you're hanging out with him as a friend, and Larry Elder, or you go to the same church as him. And he wants to talk about the degenerate behavior in the community, all the bad stuff the teens are doing, and they are. It's probably true, right? Complain about it, try to, but like, this isn't the president's job, right? So like, it's not. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for a presidential candidate to say like there's an epidemic of fatherlessness, because what are you going to do about it, right? Like,
Exactly. What is he going to? Is he going to force people to get married? What exactly can he do about that?
It's just not his job, right? That's not his job. I don't know whose job it is. I mean, maybe your pastor. It's a tough job, right? But it's definitely not the president. We don't want the president to do that, right? To tell us who we have to get married to. I mean, it's a strange thing for him to say. So I think, yeah, it depends on how you're. But now he's running for president, so I think it's fair, as you run for like president, you shouldn't be able to make these sort of cultural claims, which aren't they're not bad. I don't think they should be offended by them, but like they're cultural claims, right? Talking about the culture, which is a great thing to do, but it's not a policy thing, right? So I just think like that's my whole issue with him is your president, if you want to be like taken serious. And I do think I saw that clip, and I guess he's not allowed to debate or something. And yeah, that's messed up. They should let him debate.
Yeah, I think they didn't allow him on the. I don't know by what way they were able to disqualify him from the debate. Whether they changed some criteria or that. I thought he should have been on that debate.
Yeah, I totally support it.
Not
there.
even that.
To not let him
North
debate.
Carolina go.
Yeah, I'm definitely on his side for like he should be allowed to talk. But when he says something wrong, people should be smart enough to say something back. And if they don't, it's their fault. Like, I don't like the idea of fearing him because he's armed with a bunch of ideas that nobody can refute, right? If that's true, then he wins in a way, right? That's too bad. But like, yeah, there's a weird fear about people like him. People really don't like him. It's like, like, it's just, I think that, I don't think presidents are cultural like critics. I don't see that role for them. So,
but that's literally American. That's literally American politics, right? It's rhetoric. It's cultural rhetoric. It's showmanship. It's why is Trump so popular? It's showmanship, right? Of course, there are good sides of Trump. He was great with the economy and all that, but that isn't his strongest selling point. His strongest selling point is that he's this very charismatic, bombastic character who can can basically sell himself. That's the most compelling reason for Trump. So it's all cultural rhetoric, right? How can a presidential candidate be talking about what are your policy positions? Okay, you have stated these things. This is a problem. So what next? Then what?
That's why we vote for them. We vote for them because of their sort of rhetorical position. That's why they're popular. I agree, but I don't agree that their impact culturally is as big as people think. I think that's BS, and that's just not true. Like, I think there's this narrative that Trump was emboldening the racists, that like the racists were like in the closet, and then they saw Trump, and they were like, now I'm gonna go be a violent racist because I feel emboldened. I don't think that like the president. I don't think people are so. I think they might like the guy or not like the guy, but I don't think that like you get your morals from the president, or you decide what's right and wrong because like that's your prime American role model. I don't buy that. I never have. Like that Obama would like fix everything because he's such a good role model. I just don't think that's their job, So, but yeah, it's true that might be why they win. So I guess that's like that's what they're running on, but I don't think that's what they actually do. So that's unfortunate, Yeah.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, for a country that advanced, I would have thought that policies would be at the forefront of the discourse and the debate. How do we get things done? What is going to work? What isn't going to work? Right? Like I
Yeah.
was watching Ron DeSantis today and all that, and the first question he was asked, I can't remember the question though, but his answer was totally different from the question he was asked. His answer was about COVID and how he was able to lock down and like, dude, yeah, COVID is gone, right? As in the lockdown is
Right.
past.
That's his
That
biggest.
wasn't the question.
That's his biggest highlight. He has to bring that up because I think that's the thing he was right about, right? Like he has this big win, and the liberal people, but they don't want to admit he has this win, but he has a win, right? And then besides that, he doesn't have much. So like he keeps going back to this win, but I think at some point, like people who don't agree with him should just admit, okay, like, yeah, you as a governor are probably a good governor during COVID. You were like it's not true that everyone was dying. Like keeping schools open was probably a good choice. Like, that was a good choice. That was good. You win, but can you talk about anything else? And I don't think he can. But it is interesting that he has this big win and he used it. But every other thing he's tried to jump off on, he seems so incompetent. But he seems so competent with that one topic. So I don't know. It's tough. But maybe Ron DeSantis is an example of like, because I watched him in 2018 during the debates, and he was terrible. It was so bad, and it was
Yeah, he has the charisma of the wet socks.
Yeah, he was really like he got murdered by this other guy, and I was like, it was just I don't see how he won. He must have got. I think Trump endorsed him, which I think did help him at the time, and then he won. And then so maybe there's something to be said about like having a really non-charismatic guy. Maybe it's good. I don't know, because his performance at governor wasn't bad compared to his campaigns, which have been just miserable. So maybe campaign and performance aren't as linked as we think. That could be the case, right? So we'll see. But yeah, I just watching him answer questions is he just can't. He also seems timid, which is I think weak of him. Seems like he doesn't know what he thinks about things like Ukraine and like foreign policy. He doesn't have a strong opinion there. So that's all.
Yeah, so he's trying to play, which is ironic for someone who is going after the woke, right? He's giving it hard to the woke, but on very, very important issues that concern the whole country, he's neither here nor there. He's trying to play both sides. He's trying to be cautious and all that. Like, no, take a stand, right? Take a stand and deal with the consequences as a man. That's what you do as a politician. But one thing I wanted to highlight on essay has still been making comments about this welfare thing, right? There's this trope that black women are welfare queens, and then I ask, this welfare stuff, right? Is it only available to black women? Is it not also available to white women or Asian women? So the question is, why are black women overwhelmingly the ones being impacted by this? Why are they the ones going after this, this welfare money and kicking the men out of the house? What's going on there? What's
this is something I find frustrating because back when I was young, I learned something. I learned that more white people are on welfare than black people. I learned that in my school, which is a black school in America. Like I was taught that. I was like, oh, good. So then why do they say that? Like, why do they say that all black people are on welfare when it's actually more whites? And it's true. And I think that matters, right? I think that's hugely important. But then when like George Floyd happened and all the police shootings, I would say, well, it's probably important to recognize that there's more white people shot by the police. And they're like, no, that doesn't matter. It's all about, no, it does, right? It does matter because like, yes, obviously there's, 3 or 4 times as many white Americans as black Americans. But the way that we think about welfare, when we think about it as a black program, we think about it as something that is primarily for black people. So the fact that there's more whites on it says that's not true. Like if you took away welfare, there'd be more white people who would lose a check than black people. That matters, right? And the same thing with this like police shootings. If there was truly a what do they call it? What's the word for it? A genocide by police against black men. If that was true, then there wouldn't be more white people being killed by the police. You couldn't have it that way, right? So I think that the raw numbers, I'm a statistician, but if raw numbers are not meaningless, right? Like it's so I think that original point that there's more whites on welfare, I think that was a good point then. It's still a good point now. And I don't think I think I'd rather sort of keep that in the discourse and give up this argument about police shootings, because the police shooting argument is, I think there's this need on people to like win that argument, so they won't admit that okay, yeah, there are more whites being shot by the police. Maybe it is not as much of a racially targeted thing as we think. I think it's not, and that like the fact that more whites get shot by the police, that matters. But I also think the fact that there's more whites on welfare, that matters. That shows that I think that shows that the idea of welfare being a black program is not true. So it's I mean, the claim that Lyndon Johnson makes, or the claim that those people make, I don't know how true it is. Done a little research. I mean, I know people. I do know a lady who has a bunch of kids, and she like didn't want to get a job because she would lose her Medi-Cal. She told me that. So there is something. I don't think it's like, I don't know. I'll be honest, I don't know, but I don't think it's as, I think it's exaggerated. The idea that people are as, it's also funny, right? That these people are really poor and really uneducated, but they also are like, somehow in the minds of these conservatives, these people are like economically incredibly savvy, right? They're economically like they like navigate the welfare program and figure out a way like not to work. But these people aren't supposed to not be that good at this stuff, but they can figure this out really well, right? So I just don't think it's as direct that people are really looking at the rules and saying like, I don't want to get married because I can get a welfare check. I don't, but I do think there is some bad policies. Like in California, for example, if you make more than a certain amount of money, you can't get Medi-Cal, so you can't get health insurance for your kids. And I have a friend, he works as an Uber driver, and so he's able to sort of still get it because by working as an Uber driver, he can like write off a bunch of stuff. So he can basically falsely like make his income a lot lower than it is. So his income might be, I don't know, 80,000, but on paper it's like 30,000. He's still not rich by any means, but the cutoff's very low. So he's able to sort of get, so there are things like, there is something to be said that there probably are structures in the country where like moving from poor to not poor actually gives you some financial punishment. There's probably some truth to that, right? And I think so there are people making decisions, and it probably does affect their decision to some extent. That it does. I mean, it is really demoralizing, the idea that like, oh, you get this job, but then you lose your kids like healthcare, or like in the 70s, sometimes, oh, you could get married, but then you like lose this money, right? It is true that like those things exist. I don't think it's as obvious, or like as I'm not convinced that the motivation was as malicious as people think. Although Americans are bad with charity, I will say that's a truth, and that's something that, you know, there's a lot of worry that people will take advantage of charity, and that the wrong person will get charity, the wrong person will get something for free, and that's usually ends up being more harmful, because usually the rules that you make to like qualify for it end up like holding people back more. So I think that's true.
Yeah. So this, I think the problem really is the American system, right? Because if it's punishing people who are improving their lives and incentivizing certain bad behaviors, if women are going to be getting checks for just having kids and there is no man in the house, well, people are going to do that because people will look at the short-term benefits. They're not going to be thinking 360. They're not going to be thinking what the impacts of, not having a father in the house or not having a family is going to have on, on the kids or the family and all that. They're going to look at their self-interest at that point in time. And that's why I think that the European model is much more better, right? Nordic model or what have you, where there's kind of a safety net for almost everyone, right? So people don't really fall below a certain level. So it's not a question of, oh, I have to be below this level to be able to benefit from this, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a country where there is socialized medicine, where everybody, no matter your economic status and all that, then you don't have to fear about, oh, well, I don't need to get a job because once I get a job, I lose this benefit. Well, if you have a job, you get the benefit anyway. You don't have a job, you get a benefit anyway. So it sort of makes it it puts the genuineness in it, rather than people making mental calculations of saying, you know what, I don't need to get a job so I can get this benefit.
Mhm.
Who's not going to take that? But you're going to be working 8 hours a day to make just a little bit more than the government will be giving you if you didn't work at all.
Yeah.
Come on, people are going to take, people are going to take the, yeah, as Levi is saying, someone has to pay for it. Who's paying for the Nordic model? Who's paying for the Nordic countries? Of course, someone has to pay for
Yeah.
it.
But
Who is paying for?
we pay for all the pathologies here. Like we have a higher crime rate. We have to pay for that. So you pay for it at some point, right? Like the country pays.
Exactly.
So like it's just, I mean, I don't know what the American people do, but it's also the other problem I think is sometimes the government gives you things that again I'm not like, so for example, something I saw a lot during COVID. During COVID, the government made it so you don't have to pay your rent and you can't be kicked out. This long like moratorium. So what happened is a lot of people stopped paying rent naturally, right? Because you didn't have to. You didn't have to pay rent. And you couldn't, and it lasted for like 2.5 years. You could just stop paying rent. 2.5 years later, then you can finally get kicked out of your house. But what happens is you get kicked out of your house now, and it's really hard to qualify for an apartment now because you have on your record that you didn't pay your rent. And it's just sort of amazing that the government allowed you not to pay your rent, but there's no law, there's no like adjacent law that says also you can't discriminate on someone who didn't pay their rent during this time, right? Like it's so you do see this where the government sort of has policy to help people, but like if you accept that help, surely I guess some people just couldn't pay their rent. And I guess it's good that they weren't kicked out. But when you say you don't have to pay, like they wouldn't have paid the rent anyway. If you really don't have it, you won't do it, right? So, but there's certainly people who probably could have paid rent and did not pay rent, and now they're suffering for it. And it does seem like that's the government's fault. Like you should, if you're gonna sort of allow people to do something, then you shouldn't allow them to be like punished for that thing that you allowed. So like, there's some truth to that, right? There is, but the single mother one, I don't know. I'm skeptical that people were planning that directly to do that, but I could be wrong. Also, I just don't think the financial benefits, unless you're actually scamming, are very good. Because I don't know anyone on welfare that actually has that much money. I mean, unless you actually ran a scam, I don't think that. I don't think the problem is they were too generous on welfare. I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah. So, some points that is still going on in the chat, talking about SA is saying that the first said that the American people are not going to take that. When I talked about who's going to pay for that, and I said, the Nordic model, who's paying for it? So the American people are not going to pay for that. Well, everything, actions have consequences. If you're not going to pay for that in terms of money, right, you're going to pay for it in terms of other things, and the pathologies you're seeing right now are part of the costs that you are paying for. Oh, my freedom, I don't want to pay much taxes. And if you even look at it, the taxes between what the US and the European countries, I don't think the tax margin is so wide that the Europeans are paying so exorbitantly more than the Americans. I don't think so. I may be wrong, but I don't think so anyway.
The
But
wealthy,
aside that,
middle class Europeans pay more than like the lower middle class Americans don't pay much in taxes, and in Europe they pay a lot. That's the only difference. But the wealthy pay a lot here.
So the wealthy pay a lot here, the wealthy pay a lot there, right?
If you make a lot of money, it doesn't matter if you live in the USA or France, you're paying the same. You're going to lose half your money. That's how it works. Yeah.
So, and then America does a lot of, I would say, wastes a lot of money for, charity and what have you, the military and, aids and grants and all that all around the world, right? That's those monies can be best put to work at home, fixing some of the problems at home. I know money doesn't fix every problem, right? But there are some problems that clearly you need funds to fix it, right? So instead of saying, oh, who's going to pay for it? If the government wants people to pay for something, people are going to pay for it. It's just that the politicians do not want it to happen. They don't. Take, for example, with the aids that is going to Ukraine, right? Because Americans, when you bring up the reparations, Americans will say, well, it's taxpayers' money. We don't want to pay for it, right? Where's the money going to come from? Most Americans do not support money going to Ukraine, but the money is going anyway because the politicians want it to go.
Yeah.
So what are you talking about? You say it's your money, but you can't control it. The government is going to use it anyway, the way they see fit. But it's your money,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
So
I'll
why,
say that
why aren't you stopping it?
conservatives do support social safety nets in this country. Like, I mean, Trump, one of his biggest things, his last speeches, right, was about how he's never going to cut Social Security. Right. So like Trump supporters, by and large, love Social Security. Like the idea of the conservative, the economic conservative in the U.S., I don't think that guy really exists. Like it's very uncommon. Like most Americans want the government to spend lots of money on what they want. Like that's to me the political landscape is American people arguing about we should spend lots of money on my thing, and that's really it. Like there isn't really a big contingent of Americans who are like, don't spend money. That's just not. Maybe there was, but I think that type of like that's a losing attitude because it's not fun.
Another thing I was thinking, right? Instead of this direct cash infusion, which people can spend at their discretion, why not? Why not it be? Why did it not be in terms of services, for example, instead of giving people the money, right? There's healthcare, there's subsidized or free healthcare, there's subsidized or free education, there's subsidized or free, some of this stuff that people need to survive. Because if you're going to give money to someone and you're expecting them to use it wisely, what if they have a bad habit? Maybe they just want to smoke, maybe they just want to buy drugs, they just want to do whatever they want to do. And they're going to do all that. They're still not going to have enough money to send their kids to college. So the kids are still not going to get the best education. They're still going to be in the same rat race, still going to be in the same socioeconomic situation, perpetuating that cycle. So I just think that the whole, the way the whole system is designed.
I think you give money
just,
because you got to give people a chance, right? Like people are going to mess up with that chance, but that's. I mean, from the research I know, which isn't much to be fair, but I've read a few papers from this group, and there's some bias because this is, I'll be honest, it's the only charity I really give any money to, and it's a charity called Give Directly, and they just directly give people money, and it's pretty successful. It's surprisingly now like who you give money to and how much money isn't trivial, but like they'll go to a village in Africa or something, and they'll figure out how much money, and it'll be I don't know $7,000. They'll give 100 people $7,000, and they'll come back in a year and see what happened. And what's interesting is when people are displaced, it doesn't work. But other than that, it works pretty. Like that's the only really big failure. They had one, I forget where it was. It was there was some place where like people were in these like sort of like refugee camps, and they gave them the money, and they just kind of like spent it all on drugs, like, or they spent it on like oil, like it all like one. But like when people are sort of like living where they live, and they give them money, it's surprisingly successful. Like if people, you wouldn't almost believe how. What's interesting is the survey data about what happened and like the perception of what other people did. Is people always kind of think their neighbors, they wasted the money, but like people mostly, like so for example, they'll buy a metal roof. Because like in this village, like a metal roof is $1,000, but it lasts for 20 years, and a grass roof is like $100, but you have to get a new one every year, something like this, right? So they'll make these like capital investments for their lives, and I think there's the idea like who knows best on what they need. Well, they do, right? The people that you're giving the money to, they know better than like I do. But yes, and then there's that risk that you're saying, but like, what if they don't know? Like, what if they want to buy drugs? And yeah, it's true. But I think you lose a lot when you don't give them money because there are a lot of them that know best what they need, and you're taking that away from them. And so I think that like the fact that that is always going to be some people who like mess up with the money. And from my political perspective, it's better that the program is inefficient because some guy got money and wasted it, than the program's inefficient because the government had a bad idea. Right? It's better that like that it's their fault than it's like the person who gave the money's fault. Right? Like I think that's a better outcome. But yeah, it's a risk, but it is I mean, America could give people cash. They could. And I think it was interesting how popular that was under Trump. I mean, people still talk about that in the US. They still talk about those checks. So I don't think it's the worst idea.
Yeah, so I think there's a place for direct cash intervention, right? But I think there's also a place for, you know, looking at the system and trying to refine it, looking at the system and say, okay, this isn't working. Maybe we need a hybrid. Maybe we need to change some things. Maybe, but it seems like this is not working. This has not been working for a very long time, and it's
Yeah,
still ongoing. It's
yeah,
still ongoing. So I don't know. Probably politicians don't want to solve the problem. If they wanted to solve the
yeah.
problem, maybe they'd have thought of, a better way, to solve the problem. But it's all politics, it's still politics.
America is a very big country. I think the problem with America that people don't realize is that America does a lot of stuff. So it's hard. I think the difference with like a Nordic country in the US is the reason like people talk about why are they like, why can't we copy them? Why can't we do what they do in Sweden and like Denmark? And I want to think of a better example, but I can't think of one. So I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to bring this up, and your people probably hate me. But the example that I keep thinking of is I was reading, the Denmark sort of health authority. They during COVID, they did some investigation, and then it doesn't really matter the details here, but basically they stopped one of the vaccines for kids. They're like, this isn't good. We don't want to do this. Like our research says, no, we shouldn't do this. And that's less likely to happen in the U.S. because in the U.S. that company that made that is almost surely in the U.S. So it's sort of harder for if you have a country that's somewhat like socialized, the government's pretty powerful, and then also though all the really powerful companies are in that country, it's harder for that. It's harder to trust the state to regulate really well when there's like lobbyists and financial incentives and tons of money for the country in that decision. Whereas the Nordic countries are small, so they're just like looking at this like, is this drug good for our country? Should we spend our money on it? But they don't have a big like industry in their like country that also wants them to say yes, right? So I think sometimes the challenge with the U.S. is it's such a big country and there's so much stuff is done that when you advocate for a socialized system like in a Nordic country, the reason it fails here is that marriage between government and business that you end up getting. It ends up sort of it stretches across sort of more topics. Whereas I'm sure maybe I don't know in Denmark or Sweden or Norway, maybe there's the state is tied up. I mean, in Norway, I think they have a lot of oil. So maybe the state's tied up in like oil because that's like a huge industry. So they don't necessarily make decisions for oil that are the best for the people. They might make them the best for like that company because that company has so much power. And that's it, right? But beyond that, most of the other decisions, they can make it sort of sober-minded and they're not sort of misincentivized by this huge industry. Whereas in the US, it's full of huge industries. It's full of people that have a ton of money in that. Like it makes all the weapons, right? Like the US has lot of a lot of a lot of incentives from the sort of business side, which is why you get all these Americans who are strangely like anti-capitalist because they interpret this corruption as part of capitalism. But it's really not, right? This is just corruption, right? It doesn't have to be like there's no rule like under capitalism that the government has to buy drugs from a certain like company. That's not part of capitalism. That's just part of a system in the US where you have companies with a ton of power that are related to the like regulatory bodies, right? It's not actually like you can't blame capitalism for that. But yeah, I think that's a challenge, and that's why when you say just copy the Nordics, I think it's not. I'm not saying that we don't have any good ideas that we can take, but I just think that you're talking about like a really, and people always talk about race. They say, oh, well, it's because they're homogeneous. I think that's sort of the nonsense answer, but it's not that but they are small, and I think that gives them an advantage that we don't have.
Mm, yeah.
SA
But
does not agree with
yeah,
us, huh? This guy does not agree. It's funny.
they're small. They're small. Um, but the US is also made up of states, and these states have sort of function like countries of their own, right? So what are
Right.
these states doing? What are what are these states doing at their own level? Because automatically, when it comes to these issues, everybody shouts, "We're so big." But on other issues, oh, this is a state issue. So why aren't states, you know, domesticating some of these policies to say we might not be able to apply it on a national basis, but we can apply it on our states, on our statewide and see where it goes, right? No
Yeah,
one is thinking.
I mean, during COVID was the first time I really appreciated that. I appreciated like being in like U.S. I guess it's federalism, right? I kind of appreciated that. I appreciated that I can go to a different state and the rules are different, right? That like I'm allowed to live in multiple like mini countries. They all have their own rules. But thing is, that's maybe a little bit true for schools and a little bit true for like COVID restrictions happen to be kind of state by state. But beyond that, everything like these big issues we're talking about, like the welfare system, that's actually really bad. It's really bad because the states have their own, like the states have to, I mean, I'm not sure if you know how it works, but the states have to pay money into that. So like there's a story like in California, there's a lot of people on welfare, right? And then Bill Clinton decides I'm going to get these people off welfare. So him and Newt Gingrich, they have this deal, and the goal is to force the states to pay more money. So like right now, say the states are paying 30% of the welfare bill, and the government pays 70%. That's usually how like when the federal government pays for things, what they really do is they pay for most of it, right? So they'll tell the state if you like give these poor people health care, well, we'll pay 80% of the bill because the state will usually take that deal because they don't have to pay a percentage, right? So like this, the federal government says we're going to give you welfare, we pay 80%, but then they said each year we're going to go down 10%. If you're on welfare for 2 years, the federal government's only going to pay 40%. So the idea was, this will like motivate the states to get people off of welfare. But what happened, California, what happened is the state, I'm not lying, this is insane. They're using state tax money to hire lawyers. And lawyers would call people up who are on welfare. And they would try to get them moved to federal disability. Because then the state pays zero. Right. So a lot of times you think, oh, it's great that the US has these states, but the problem is like you have these, and that's just complete waste of money because you're basically the state that you live in is spending your tax money to hire a man to move someone from a state and federal program to a purely federal program. Both of them are all run by your taxes, but they're being moved around because the state's trying to save money. From the state's perspective, that's good. If they get you off of state welfare, they save half the money. It's great. And from the person's perspective, federal disability probably pays like a little bit more too. So it's actually everyone wins except for everyone, right? So I think a lot of times, yeah, the states don't have that much power, and which I used to think was fine, but now like it would at least be interesting if states could kind of make more decisions. But yeah, the healthcare system, like because we have federal Medicare, that's national, and then Medi-Cal or like the like Medicaid, like these ones are usually state and federal run. The federal government just has so much money, man. Like they have all the money, and they can also print money, which the states can't do. So it's just like it would be cool if the U.S. and of course like foreign policy, that's federal, right? So like these big issues like foreign wars, healthcare, military spending, like the states they can't do much, man. But it's a, and then you see what happens like with like Roe v. Wade, right? Like things like this happen, and it's like I don't think people like that. So,
Wow, that's interesting.
you guys have states?
Yeah, we do. We have 36 states
Do they
and one
matter?
federal country. Do they what?
Do the states matter? Like, does it matter which state you're in? Are laws different? Like, do you think it's very meaningful or not meaningful?
Yeah, certain laws can be different, here and there. We have state legislature, right, that can pass laws that's for each state, but it's still a very federal top-down system, right?
Okay.
It's even though the country was my country, the current political system we are running was fashioned after the American system. I mean, when we got independence, we were running a parliamentary system after the British, but
Yeah.
after a while, it was changed to this presidential system. But the federal government still has a lot of power, so there are a lot of things on the exclusive legislative list, which is what the federal, like a power that is energy generation, security. Like we don't have state police, all the police are
No.
federal.
Oh,
Yeah, we
wow.
don't have state police, which is something that we've been calling for. We need state police to tackle these security issues that are peculiar to each state. But no, those are, and even though the governors are called the chief security officers of their states, they don't even have the powers to give directives to the commissioner of police in the state. That's he answers straight to the man in the federal capital territory in Abuja. So yeah, it's still pretty much top down.
Yeah, the U.S.
So
the states are. That's another interesting thing is our police. I didn't think about that, but it's interesting that part of the reason why, like, I don't know if you saw, but like during 2020, like Kamala Harris and all of these like politicians were like very much supportive of these like riots and protests against police. But it's interesting that like those aren't their police, right? That like in Nigeria, if the politicians were against the police, it's like, well, the police work for you, man. It's like, I mean, I saw a little bit of that in the U.S. De Blasio was like protesting the police, and I thought this was kind of nonsense because like he's the like mayor of New York, and the police they answer to the mayor. So it's like, why are you joining a protest when you're their boss? It's like it's a little bit right. It doesn't make that much sense that you're the mayor.
all political stunts.
Yeah, right. So that was, but I feel like the reason why it doesn't seem so crazy is because yeah, it's interesting. Our federal officers, like people in Congress, they are not related to state police. So it's interesting that they're very supportive, for example, of like the FBI. They will have nothing to say about that's our federal police. It's smaller, but there's this big gap between like state worker and federal worker, and then like in New York we even have city worker. So you can work for the city government, the state government, the federal government, and they're completely separate. But yeah, it is interesting that the federal people work for the federal government. Yeah, they have no allegiance to the police. They don't have to, but they would in a country like Nigeria, right? Those people would be of the same system, but they're not here. Which I don't know if that's good or bad. I guess maybe good. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it is.
Everything has its own downsides and positive side. Like one of the kind of drawbacks for having state police in my country is this fear that the governors are going to abuse, they're just going to abuse the police, the powers of the police to do whatever they want, right? So there's that fear that, you don't want to concentrate that kind of executive powers in the hands of the governors, right? So but still the people have been calling for state policing. It's a very popular, call that let's have our state
police. Right now,
police.
the police are all under one guy, right?
What?
Right now, the police in Nigeria are all under the federal government.
Yeah, under the federal government.
Isn't that worse? Isn't that a bigger risk? Like one government can control everything.
Well, it's a big risk. It really is a big risk because
I mean, if you had state police, each governor of each state would control their police, and if one of them was really corrupt, then maybe the federal government could do something about it or something, right? Like you would at least have some diversity, hopefully.
Yeah.
It wouldn't all be equally corrupt, right? So like you can see, yeah.
So there are those two camps. When we're used to the federal system, we know the issues with the federal system. The grass is always greener the other side, right? The grass is always greener. So well, the police are not doing as well as we want them to do. So why not we have the state police? And there are others that are like, oh no. The governors are pretty corrupt on their own, and the little power they have, they abuse it. If you give them more power, they are going to abuse it more. So stuff like that.
It's probably complicated. It probably depends on how big the states are, right?
Yeah. The states that vary in terms of size, in terms of population, they usually vary and not all the same. Just like in the US, some states are massively bigger, some states are massively richer, some states are basically just dependent on the federal government, allocations by the end of the month. Some states generate more internal revenue than others, so the dynamics are different.
Yeah, I mean the U.S. I think I don't know how true it is, but I imagine it's true. Like these really, really small police departments can really become corrupt, right? You have like some small town. There's only like 2 cops in that town, and it's like whatever these guys are in charge, right? Like they can do. I mean, that doesn't mean they are corrupt, but they have a little bit kind of like their power is a little bit like unchecked because they run things there. So I can see why like you'd be afraid if you are from a really small state of having police because they would just sort of be in charge of everything. But I think, I don't know, I feel like big police departments like New York or like Los Angeles, it's big enough that you don't have that. I don't think the size of New York and the size of the federal government are that different. They're both big enough, right? It's both huge, like police forces. But maybe when it's really small, probably things feel like a little different. You have like the sheriff in town or something like that. But yeah, no, I mean it's the federalism is an interesting thing because growing up, I was always like, I mean, in America, the people would say states' rights, and there was for a long time that was sort of a euphemism for being like pro-racist. And a lot of it was that because people who supported states' rights were usually Southerners, of course, like the ultimate states' rights was like the Civil War. So the states' rights they wanted was like this the states' rights to do slavery.
Yeah.
So because of that history, I think the reason why it allowed the federal government to get a lot more power because people were really suspicious of the idea of states needing any power. And I mean, I kind of thought that. I was like, why the hell do states need rights? Just so they can do bad stuff. Like the only reason why a state would want any power is to do something wrong. But I think that's probably not true, right? I think there is a benefit to allowing states to experiment. I think it's we saw it, and I think that it's good. It's good to have some experimentation. Now, of course, it creates problems like this new Roe v. Wade thing. I don't know how true this is, but if they're going to criminalize abortion in a different state, that's like
I don't understand.
So like they were trying to make it against the law if you're in Texas or something and you go to California.
Travel to another state.
Yeah, or it's like someone drives you there. And it's like
That's crazy.
That's the problem with state law, right? There's a problem with state law is like if they're in conflict, then we're not really one country, right? Like if you do something legal in one state, it can't be illegal in a different state. Right? So you have to have, I think for the states to work, you have to have like some understanding of like an acceptance of what goes on in your state, right? You can't say like Texans aren't allowed to go to California and do something that Texans can't because when they're in California, they're in Californians now.
Yeah, people can move and do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make any sense to me. I for one don't support abortion. I think it's the murdering of a child. I think it's the killing of a child, right? But I also want people to have sensible laws and to act within the ambits of the laws, right? So the federal government has pushed it to, let's say the federal government have pushed it to states. Let each state decide for themselves what they want their laws to be, right? You can't, I think it's an overreach for you to say someone who moves from Texas to California to have an abortion should be, it wasn't committed that crime wasn't committed in Texas, right? It was done in California where it is okay to do that. So I think it's an overreach. It's a big overreach, and
I think it's a problem, right? When you allow states to have power, they sometimes do overreach, right? Because they think of themselves as in charge of their people, but really they should be in charge of their land, right? So it should be like you can't have abortions in Texas, but it can't be that Texas can't have abortions. But the problem is like that is what governments do, right? Like in the U.S., if you take your wife to some other country and you rape her, like that can still be illegal, right? Even if it's legal there, right? So like that can become really complicated, right? But like you can definitely sue somebody for something that happened in like a different country. Like so like those laws are complex. But yeah, if you're gonna have a country, you have a federal country, you can't do that, right? Maybe that works across countries, but like you can't freely move from state to state and also have laws that make you a criminal somewhere else. But we do see that happening. And that's the thing about the abortion debate that I've been most critical of. I'm like, come on, you can't. Like, you guys they just overturned Roe v. Wade, and you want to make abortion illegal. And now you want to make it illegal in the States. It's like, you can't have that. You have to,
and there'll be a very big blowback.
You want to have the right to choose. Like, they always argue, like, the conservative states are always like, we don't want to ban abortion. We just want to ban it here. Yeah. But the truth is, like, they always want more, and I think that's the problem with the states. Is like they want it all, man. So that's a tough one.
And it's going to, the consequences are going to be dire because there will be a big blowback, which might even roll back all these, all the gains and the successes they've had.
One thing about stats, you want to understand something I think is fake stats. Abortion is popular in the U.S. I stand by that, and
abortion is what?
It's popular. Abortion is popular, and so is the death penalty. And liberals and conservatives will argue about those, and they'll lie to you, and they'll use really bad statistics, because both of these things, the statistic is usually from some survey. And if you read how the survey questions are asked, the other one was reparations was an insanely popular according to some survey. But like, you read the survey questions, and the survey question said something about like, do you think people who are enslaved should get reparations? But then they would ask people like, what's your race? And they said, do you have enslaved ancestors? And almost everyone said no. So it's what were they really answering? Were they talking about themselves? Like, but I just think these survey questions can be really misleading. But if you look at the data, I think the best data is the voting, right? I think that's the only real survey Americans take, is when they step in and they vote. That's where they're saying how they feel. But when they answer a question on a survey, it's just, so what's interesting is when you ask people, are you against abortion? People say, I'm against abortion. Right? I don't believe in it. I wouldn't do it. And a lot of times it's like what you said, right? Like, I think it's killing a baby. The woman said, I would never have an abortion. But then you ask people, like, do you want to make it federally illegal? So if a woman has an abortion, she goes to prison. People won't say yes. So that is a really unpopular idea here. And what's interesting is it's a different idea from whether or not you're pro-abortion. But the idea is that, do you want to prohibit abortion? And I think you see the same thing with the death penalty. The people who are against it will tell you, Americans don't like the death penalty. Americans don't like it. But if you look at, like, in California is pretty liberal. And Gavin Newsom put another proposition on to eliminate the death penalty. It failed. People don't, and it's not that people like the death penalty. People don't like the idea of never using the death penalty. Like, people are like, let's keep that option, right? Let's keep that option even if we never do it. Like, it's so, I think what's interesting is people, despite their political biases, I think the stronger bias, what I think is a good thing about Americans, the stronger bias is against getting rid of an option. So it's like, let's not make abortion impossible. Let's not make it so we can never use the death penalty. What if some guy does something really, maybe he should die? Like, even if nobody today should, like, they don't want to never do that. And so I think with abortion, it's the same thing. The people who are anti-abortion, they say they'll do these surveys where people are against it. But does that mean they want it completely prohibited? And it looks like no. It looks like statistically, if you want to be honest, and I mean, this is, I think, a good example, because liberals won't admit that people do like the death penalty, and conservatives won't admit that people do like abortion. But I shouldn't say like abortion. That people aren't going to get behind your idea to ban this. They might say they might say it in church, but this is not. It's like not. People don't love the idea of eliminating a right, even if it's a right that they think is terrible. Like eliminating a possibility, right? They like to keep some possibilities open, because even if they're against it, maybe they change their mind, or somebody else. It's just, I think that's a truth about politics that these questions don't get at, because the questions are usually trying to ask, are you a fan of this thing? It's a different question than, do you want it prohibited? If you want it illegal, what do you want the punishment to be? So if a woman has an abortion, what do you want to be done to her? If she like gets some drugs and takes the drugs and she terminates her pregnancy, like, what should happen? That's like, I think when you start to ask people that, they start to seem like they're not as against abortion, right?
Yeah.
And so
for me, there are certain things that are in the moral sphere. There are certain things that are in the criminal or civil sphere, right? So for things in the moral sphere, my proclivity is you do you, right? I don't think it should be criminalized. Do whatever the hell you want to do. So, but for the case of abortion, why I think it has moral components to it, but why I think it's more than the moral component is because I recognize that the child is a separate entity. It's a human being. It has life, so it needs to be protected, right? So that's on that ground I would say that the state can intervene, or the state can take action against anybody who terminates that life. But if it wasn't the case, that the fetus is a separate entity, is a life of its own. For example, a woman should be able to do whatever the hell she wants to do with her eggs or with her womb, right? If you want to get a hysterectomy, in fact, I usually say my body, my choice is best exemplified with a hysterectomy or with the one that men do.
vasectomy.
Vasectomy, right? That's your body, your choice. If you want to get a vasectomy, go right ahead. If you want to take off your womb, go right ahead. But you're not going to be allowed to kill a child that's growing inside you. You're two separate beings, you're two separate entities. So I would support the state intervening, so you don't murder a child. But aside that, you do you. Or if it's a
It's
moral
obviously
case, you do.
complicated because a woman who's pregnant is not is like is she allowed to drive a motorcycle? Would you say no? Because if she gets on a motorcycle, the chance that she kills her kid is much higher, right? So I think that's the challenge. Is like, are you going to say that when women are pregnant, they lose all their autonomy for 9 months because now there's somebody else, but that person can't live without them? So
No,
like, I think that's the
I
hard
think
part
they
about these issues, right? Is that we don't. I think Americans don't agree on a moral framework for what is the value of not killing people, even. Like if you ask
so
people,
so the,
why is it wrong to
the
kill? I think
difference
that's a hard question.
the difference is the woman who is driving a motorcycle is not driving it with the intent to kill, right? She's not doing it specifically to harm the baby, right? But abortion, like Essay is saying, is intentional, right? You're intentionally ending the life. Of course, being in the motorcycle for a pregnant woman might increase the chances that she might get into an accident that may be detrimental for the baby. But the intent there is what is different. So I
Yeah,
can
but what if she's
argue
just getting drunk? What if she just drinks a lot when she's pregnant? Is that allowed?
she just drinks a lot.
Yeah, because she likes to drink.
Ah,
Not she has no intent to her. She just loves drinking. Does she lose her right to drink now because she's pregnant? So she basically belongs to the state until the
I
baby's
don't
born.
think she should. I don't think she should lose her right to drink. It's a tricky one, man. It's a
She
tricky
shouldn't,
one, but
she shouldn't do it.
yeah,
I
she
think we all
shouldn't do
do
it. She
should admit
shouldn't do it.
it. But yeah, of course not. It's terrible. Like, you could really hurt the kid, right?
Yeah.
But it is if when you say like there's that like that's another person. I think then if you really believe that, then you start to get into a point where she needs to lose a lot of rights. And I don't think it makes sense that women while pregnant, it's a long time. It's not like it's one day. If it was one day, it'd be like fine. You're pregnant for one day. You have to like go sit in this safe room for one day. You can't
Yeah,
harm. This is
but
9 months, so it's like almost a year. You
abortion
can't do this.
abortion is a very definite thing. We can have conversations around the other things, right? But this is terminal. This is like a deliberate action of, what, we want to end this life, right? So the woman who likes to drink and might harm the baby, she's not saying I want to end this life. She's not saying I want to harm this baby. She might even be persuaded to choose, a better lifestyle because of her baby. A lot of women are persuaded that way,
But
right?
that,
A
but
lot.
part of the reason why you know she's not doing that is because right now you're in a framework where abortion is legal. So all the women who really want to have an abortion just have an abortion. So she's drinking. It's yes. I don't think women drink to kill their kid because they could have an abortion.
Yeah.
But if they couldn't have an abortion, would you have more people doing things that look like individual risky behaviors because they want to terminate their pregnancy, right? So like obviously they're not doing it for that reason now. But that's one argument for why abortion should be legal because you don't want people doing that, right? You don't want people harming their kid for like their own because you can tell them if you really don't want to have a kid, you can have an abortion, but don't hurt your kid out, like because that's sort of the compromise. I think it's a tough one, but I think Americans don't like it's an issue to me because we don't even agree on when it's right to kill. Like, I mean, in Canada, I don't know if you're following, but in Canada they have a suicide thing that people really don't like. But it's pretty morose. I can't say that I'm a fan of it, but it's hard to. I read this book a long time ago. It's a Peter Singer book, and I think one of the best arguments for like having an ethical framework around things like abortion and murder and suicide. And his argument, which I think is the most compelling, is that like people they deserve rights based on their interest in them, which I think is pretty
would
strong.
I would even be more of I would even be in favor of assisted suicide more than I would be in favor of abortion, because with assisted suicide there's the possibility of choice, right? There's a
Yeah,
possibility that this person is saying, uh, my uncle died of cancer, right?
yeah.
And he was 44 years old when he died, and I knew the pain he went through those those months that he was sick, and I I could see him being tortured by the cancer, right? And if there was anything that could alleviate his pain, he was going to die anyway. If there was anything that could have alleviated his pain,
Yeah,
I
for sure.
wish to God he could have had it, right?
Yeah.
So for situations like that, where people have the choice to make that kind of choice, I know it's not moral, right? If you want to put it in that sense, right? That's a different thing. But you ending the life of a child, the child doesn't have a choice in that sense. You can say, well, the child didn't have a choice of whether they want to be born or not. Yes, that's a different situation, but they are alive right now. You can't make that decision for them. You can't make the decision of for ending their life. I don't support assisted suicide, but if I were to be given an option between abortion and assisted suicide, I'd go for assisted suicide. That's something I'd support.
I mean, yeah, I see the difference. I just think that the idea that the child has interest isn't really there yet, and that is sort of, if you think about the framework behind our laws and our ideas, is that interest is what grants you rights. Right? You have rights because of your interest. And
Well, a 6 months old baby doesn't have interests.
it's true. That's true. No, it's not true though, because people presumably have interest in the 6 months old baby. That's the
The
interest that
six months
derives.
old baby himself doesn't express any interest.
It's true.
That's
It's
any
true.
that's any different from when it was in the
No, but the mother is interested in the 6 months. The grandparents care about the six. Like you think about like, why is it wrong to kill somebody? It's like from the very basic level. It's like, well, you don't want to cause suffering. But what if someone like kills you in your sleep? Also, like it's really traumatic for people to know they're going to die. Like that's causes a ton of trauma. Like nobody wants that. But what if someone kills you in your sleep? So you have no idea that you're going to die. But then all the people that care about you, like you're like violating all their interests, right? So like murder usually violates a lot of interest when you kill somebody. And when a baby is born, clearly like there's tons of people that are interested in that baby's life, right? Like without
well,
people, that baby would
there,
die.
there's
Without
there's no
society,
there's no, but you can extend that to there are tons of people that would still be interested in the baby in the womb, right?
well, that's the question: is do you
But
have a right to have interest in something that's in someone else's body? And I think that's the whole issue. Some people say yes, and some people say, but that's what it comes down to.
it doesn't matter if it's in someone else's body, it's a separate entity. It's still a separate entity. So I can have an interest in it, right? It's a separate
Yeah, I mean, you
entity.
can, you
It's not
can.
like it's
That's
one-
that's fair. It's fair that you do. You can. I just think, but I think that is the real line, right? Is are you interested in what goes on in that sort of, are you interested in something that's happening in someone else? Like is that your business yet? If you think it is, then yeah, you can be against abortion. If you think it's not, you can't be against it. I think that's the real issue, is not whether
it's
it's
my business
killing
insofar
or not.
as the other being is a person. It's a separate being.
Yes, but there's other persons that you don't have interest in their life. So you don't have interest in all lives, right? Some people, like you said, they want to die or something like. So you don't have interest in all lives, right? So why do you have interest in that life? That's the question, right?
Well,
Why you
because
in that person?
why I have interest in that is because the option of choice is not available to that life. So I will err on the side of um, making that decision for them. That okay, if they had a choice, I would respect their choice,
Yeah.
but they don't have choice here. So
Yeah, but they
who's to
lack
know?
capacity to
Maybe
have.
some babies, yeah, maybe some babies would actually prefer to be aborted, right?
Well,
Some babies would actually prefer to be born, right?
yeah,
So if that was a choice available to the babies and they could make that choice and they said, you know what, I'm not going to be born to a parent in Nigeria, it's going to be too much suffering, then go right ahead. But
yeah.
that choice is not there.
No, but I think the only argument I'm trying to make is that there is a interest is not. It's there's levels basically. So for example, why do we eat meat, right? Like why do we eat some meat and not other meat? Why do some people eat fish but not chicken? And why do people not eat apes, for example? They don't want to eat chimpanzees.
I think it's cultural attitudes. I just think for that, it's cultural
Really?
attitudes.
Do you think the reason
It's,
to not eat?
yeah.
You think it's all religious? Then you don't think there's any like rational way to try to come at this? I think there is. I think there's some sense that like some animals have a greater interest in being alive, and then so therefore people think it's more wrong to eat those animals. It's like a more intelligent animal.
But that's a moral argument. That's not a it's not an objective. For example, in my country, right, there are some
Yeah.
people who eat dogs, right, which I find reprehensible. I mean, a dog is like, to me, a dog is like like a family member, right? They're so
Yeah.
intelligent, they're so you get. But I won't judge them if I want to remove morality from it, if I want to remove my feelings from it, then there's absolutely no reason why they can't eat a dog.
Why not?
There's no reason.
But wait,
Because it's
but why?
in a logical sense, because it's an animal, it's a food source, it's nutrition, it's
So
not
if
a
someone
human
has an
being.
abortion and they eat the baby, is that okay?
No, I say it's not a human being. I draw the line at
Oh
cannibalism.
yeah, yeah. So but I'm saying you think that there's a line between humans and other life.
Yes.
So it's not life that bothers you; it's the human life.
No, it's human life
Yeah.
specifically.
So I think that my problem with that issue is that's a religious statement, right? The claim that human life is special is a religious idea. Like this is not a scientific idea. Like we don't have any evidence that, like humans are unique. They're more capable, but like the difference between a human capability and a chimpanzee is way less than between like a chimpanzee and a sea sponge, right? Like
Yeah.
a chimpanzee is way more capable, way more interested in being alive, has way more capacity than like a small bug or like a single cell organism. They're way more complex. So if like the idea that humans would have value but chimpanzees would not, I don't see where. I guess yeah, if you believe that humans are special because God said so or something, that's religious. I think that rationally, the reason I feel like humans are more valuable than other animals is I feel like humans have more interest, right? Like if I kill a fly, I don't think the fly suffers the same way. I don't think the fly is interested in being alive. I don't think it has a concept of time or knows how old it is and wants to make it till tomorrow.
But
I don't think there's as much
ignorance
because it's not ignorance.
ignorance doesn't because
It's
you
not
don't it's about you, it's about what you're feeling at that point in time. You don't feel that the fly has interest, but the fly obviously has interest from his own perspective. He wants to leave, that's why it's a fly, that's why it's moving around looking for food, and those things are driven by interest, right? So you're looking at it from a human framework, and you're saying well, based on my human framework, the fly doesn't have interest.
I
It
didn't say
does.
I
And
didn't
then
say
you
I didn't
to
say
know.
that. I said I think it has less capacity for interest than human. That's my argument. Not that it has none.
Well, let's
It has more capacity.
at what point do you what's the threshold for a critical level of capacity that's acceptable by you? What's the threshold?
Well, I think
Because like the
you can make
capacity is
the
on a
argument.
spectrum.
You could make the argument that the level is exactly what humans have, right? And that's why you should not kill humans only, if you really want to say that. But I think that, yeah, I don't think I know the exact point, obviously, but I think that like I can tell the difference between a human and a single cell organism. Single organism really doesn't have like. I mean, I've worked with these little worms you can work with in science, and they basically have like a heat receptor on them. And the heat receptor synapses with the like photoreceptor. So it'd be like as if when you walk toward the fire, you had a receptor that turned your legs and made you walk the other way. So I would say like if that was how your body worked, I wouldn't say that you have any interest in not being burned necessarily, because like there's no synapse, there's no brain, there's no like concept. I don't want that to happen.
No. But if there was no interest in it not getting burned, it wouldn't have that feature that takes it away from the heat itself. It would simply just go along with it. It would just go into the fire.
Evolution had this interest for it to adapt to have this, but I think that it doesn't have interest in not being burned. It just can't get burned now because it has this protection where it turns away from fire. But that's automatic. It's not thinking. It's like a reflex, right?
Yeah, but it's interest. Interest doesn't always have to involve thinking. It's interest of self-preservation, right? That's why it evolved that feature. If not,
no, I guess I'm defining interest as no, it does involve thinking. So I'm saying that when I say interest, because the idea that you don't want to get burned is before you get burned, you think this is going to be painful. I don't want this, right? So like the idea to you can be traumatic without it happening. But for a fly, I'm not so sad, but for these worms, that doesn't exist for them. They don't have a
That doesn't
concept of I don't want this to happen,
that
right?
doesn't exist for babies either.
But yeah, it doesn't exist for like babies. I agree, it does not. Which is why I think
So
that's argument for abortion. And I agree that like if you don't have interest in something, then you don't have the same. Then
that
like you
that
can't not want it
that
to happen.
doesn't apply for, when I mean babies, I mean live babies, born babies. I mean a child, a child develops this quote unquote interest as they interact with the world, right? A child that's never known fire before is going to go towards it and put his hand there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, no, I agree.
He's not operating from a frame of I know this is going to be bad. No, he's just like the worm, right? His reflexes and his instincts when he touches the fire, just like the worm that is going to take him away from there. So in
Yeah,
that sense, the worm and the child is exactly the same thing. So
yeah, no, I agree. I agree that like you can make this argument that if you're pro-abortion, you're pro-infanticide, right? You say, well, if you can kill a fetus who lacks capacity, why can't you kill a 1-year-old? Why can't you kill a 2-year-old? Well, okay, fine. Let's just say that you believe that, but eventually you think that's not true, right? Eventually the child does have interest. So like you would say like I don't know, when they're 6 years old you can't kill them anymore, right? So like if you really want to say, they say someone who believes in abortion should believe in killing up to age 4 or something, right? But it's also at what level do you decide they have interest? You have to it's going to be totally arbitrary, right? Yeah, you have to
at,
decide.
at the level they start showing signs of life, we know that signs of life includes reproduction. The cells, once the male gametes and the female gametes meet together, there's rapid reproduction. The cells begin to divide. Signs of life include movement. Yeah, in the womb it moves. It moves from where it was fertilized to be implanted in the womb. Right. Signs of life includes respiration. It respires. There's gaseous exchange between the cells.
I
And
agree that those are signs of life. I don't agree that those.
so,
I don't think those are signs of interest, though. Interest in being alive. I think those are
yeah,
just signs.
but life is more important to me than interest. I think life is human life. The fact of human life, the signs of human life is more important than interest. It's a more objective metric for me because, like we have said, what if someone has a mental issues where they cannot recognize, they for all they don't have an interest. They're mentally incapacitated that they don't have an interest, right? And they're 25 years old. Should we say, oh, they don't have interest, so it's perfectly fine to just kill them? No, we wouldn't say that. So I think, exhibiting those objectively biological signs of life should be the basis for saying, yeah, this thing should not be killed, or this being should not be
Yeah,
killed.
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but I think that it does require you to believe humans are special, right?
Yeah, I
So
do believe humans are special.
yeah, but which is fine to believe that, but I think that is still a religious
Yeah,
standpoint.
so
And I don't want to have
there
religion
has to
and law. I think it's ideally religion and law are different. That's my point.
so
So I
so
think that's the issue with that. That's not a good justification because you shouldn't have religion and law. That's all.
well, it has to start somewhere. The how will I, the subjective has to s- there has to be a meeting point for the subjective and the objective from which then it takes off, right? If not, everything is kind of subjective. For example, yes, if I wasn't a religious person, if I wasn't religious, then there's really no logical basis for me to think that human life is special. I draw that from my religious affiliation. So, logically speaking, if I wanted to remove religion, then there is no it becomes a word of nihilism. Everything is allowed, anything is allowed, right? If you can do it, then you should do it. There is no objective basis for making anything. There's no objective basis for even making laws, right? If everybody decides today and say, you know what, we're going to become cannibals without the religious framework, I think it should be allowed. It should be allowed.
I don't think a country where no one's religious. I mean, the Nordic countries have like no one is religious. They still have laws. I don't think losing
Yeah,
religion.
they have laws. They have laws. They have laws. I'm just saying from a logical perspective, if they decide to not have laws, right? If they decide to not have
Yeah,
laws based on their framework of not having religion, it is perfectly okay within that framework.
No, because instead of
It's
religion, we have another like moral and 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 like an ethical framework. And that's what I'm saying. Like we all have different interests, and we need to get
all
along. We
all
need to
all
pass laws to
all
protect.
morality, all morality and ethical frameworks objectively derive from a religious source.
Oh no, I don't know about that. You think so?
Objectively derived from a religious source. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If
I don't.
not, it's subjective. If not, it's subjective. If there is no religious framework behind it, then it's subjective and
It has
anything
to be
should be
fair.
allowed.
I mean, I guess it's not as authoritative for sure, because if you don't have a supernatural, I mean, you can't beat God as an authority. I mean, the concept of God is the ultimate authority. So I guess yes, any framework for rules and laws that isn't based on God is not going to be as authoritative. That's true. I don't think it's true. It has to be completely subjective though. But yeah, I mean, you're right that like, I mean, America is still probably somewhat religious. I think it's more so. But I do believe that if there's like a law or a policy and you support it and you think I only support this because of my religion, I think that then you probably shouldn't support it, because I don't think that we should do things based on our religion as far as laws, as far as like taking away people's rights. I think that we need a better argument, because we have, at least in this country, we have lots of religions, and if you're gonna have a lot of people of different religions and like different faiths and different opinions on that, then like that's probably not it's not justified to take away rights because of that. That's how I feel. So it's just, but yeah, I mean, sure, if you believe humans are uniquely valuable, not because of their capacity to be valuable, but just because they're human, then of course,
Yeah.
yeah, like why would you be pro-abortion? It's like, if it's the moment you believe it's human, it's uniquely valuable. I don't know. I don't know how valuable we are, man. Like humans are great, right? Like I'm not sure I don't know how good we are. Like we're really good, but we can be really bad too. So yeah.
Yeah, the amount of stupidity
I know.
in humanity it just makes you to wonder, are we really that valuable with this level of stupidity and
It's a
ignorance
weird
that just
humans are it's really strange, right? The humans who like argue over the silliest things have evolved. If you don't believe in God, then you believe that humans basically evolved to just like survive. They're just like big apes, but they can also like do such incredible things sometimes, right? It is strange that like our capacity is so high in some way and so low at the same time. Like they're definitely a weird species. So maybe there's something special about them. I don't know. Maybe that's God. I'm not sure. But I think the abortion debate is interesting. But I think overall in the U.S., I think people will lean towards not having more prohibitions. I think it's when you ask Americans, at least, and you start to ask them, do you want women in prison for having abortions? I think they'll say no. And if you say no, then you can't really be against it, right? That's the problem with all these things. Is if you're against something but you don't believe, it's like like today, liberals are really pro gun control, but they're also really against putting someone in prison when they have a gun, and that's hard to understand sometimes, right? Because like you can not like something, and you can maybe try to convince people not to do it, which is fine. Like if you're wanting to convince people not to do abortions, like that's like I totally respect that. If you are against abortion and you devote your whole life to reducing abortion, that's great. But if you're against something and you want it to be illegal, then you probably also should have an opinion that people who do it should be punished, right? Because that's how the state makes things illegal, right? They punish you when you break the law. So like I just think that most Americans are gonna probably fall. It'd be interesting to see. I could be wrong, but I think they'll fall on one side, or else we're gonna get what we have now, which is like the in California you're gonna be like allowed to have an abortion until the kid's 2, and like Louisiana you can't even think about an abortion. It's like I hope that doesn't happen, because like that could happen where it just gets super extreme on like both sides. But I think overall that like that political thing that happened, I think it won't help the Republicans. I think it'll hurt them in the long run to have overturned Roe versus Wade. I just think voters are going to punish them for that, which is bad because it's good to have parties that are somewhat competitive. And I think that hurt that. So
Yeah, the Republicans are very good at losing when they
incredible
have,
at losing,
you know,
right? It's kind of shocking how good they are.
it's like it's like they are masters of losing, even when they are clearly the favorites to win.
Yeah, it's
There's
pretty true.
absolutely no reason why Joe Biden should have won that election. But
Yeah,
Trump being Trump.
yeah.
Anyhow,
Republicans are, I guess that's what they are. They're the party that like loses. We'll see, but yeah, it is. It always shocks me to see something like, well, the Republicans will definitely win this time, but they don't. They still don't win. They find a way to like lose every single time. So we'll see. But yeah, I don't think this will help them. That's all I'm saying. But yeah, the friends in the chat
So-
do not agree with me, but that's fine.
well, some agreed, some didn't. It's
Tell
like
this
that.
guy he's wrong about that though. A
Yeah.
human is a great ape. So that's a categorical. I can't argue with that, right?
Yeah.
We are apes.
So, Tade,
Yeah.
thank you
All
very
right, man.
much.
No
We've
problem.
done
I
2
hope I
hours.
helped. All right, man.
Yeah. So thanks for coming, and
No problem. No problem,
catch
man.
you some other time.
Yeah, cool, man.
All right. Bye for now.